I went to Lassen Volcanic last year on a clear day that felt calm in a way that made everything seem sharper. The sky was blue but thin, the kind of blue that makes the air feel dry and empty. I remember pulling into the trailhead parking area and sitting in my car for a moment longer than usual. I told myself I was just getting my pack ready, but really I already felt uneasy. It was not fear exactly. It was more like my body knew something my mind did not. My chest felt tight, my stomach felt hollow, and I kept scanning the trees without knowing why. The trailhead was quiet. Too quiet. No voices, no engines, no movement except for a light breeze brushing the tops of the pines. The ground smelled like warm dirt and sulfur, that faint rotten egg smell that always hangs around volcanic areas. I locked my car and started walking, telling myself this was normal, that lots of people hike here and nothing ever happens. Still, every step felt heavier than it should have. As I moved farther along the trail, the uneasy feeling stayed with me. It did not fade the way nerves usually do once I get moving. Instead, it settled in and became steady, like a low pressure sitting on my shoulders. The trail wound through trees and patches of rock, with steam vents visible in the distance. Every sound stood out. The crunch of my boots on gravel sounded too loud. The wind moving through the branches felt like something brushing past me, even when nothing was there. I tried to focus on the scenery. The vents were impressive, steam rising from the ground like the earth was breathing. The ground around them looked fragile, stained yellow and white from minerals. The air felt warmer there, damp and sharp in my lungs. I slowed down and took it in, but even standing there, the anxiety did not leave. I kept turning my head, checking behind me, listening for footsteps or movement that did not belong to me. After a while, I decided to turn back. It was an out and back trail, and the thought of heading back toward my car felt like relief. I took a few steps away from the vents, and that was when I heard it. A low growl. Not loud, not aggressive, but deep and heavy. It came from somewhere off the trail, close enough that I felt it more than heard it. I froze. My body locked up before my mind could even catch up. My hands went cold. My heart slammed in my chest, so hard it almost hurt. I stood there, barely breathing, listening. The forest felt like it was holding its breath with me. I scanned the trees, the brush, the rocks, trying to see movement. Nothing stood out. No animal, no shape, no sound except my own pulse in my ears. After what felt like a long time, I started moving again. Slowly, carefully. Every step was placed on the ground as gently as I could manage. I kept my eyes moving, never letting them settle for too long. Then I heard it again, not the growl this time, but the sound of leaves shifting and twigs snapping. Heavier than a deer. Slower. Deliberate. That was when I saw it. A black bear, about 40 yards away, moving through the trees. It was walking the same direction as me, away from where I had been standing, but close enough that the space between us felt dangerously small. It did not look at me at first. It just moved, calm and steady, powerful without trying. I froze again. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running felt like the fastest way to make everything worse. I kept my eyes on the bear, watching its shoulders roll as it walked, watching how easily it moved through the brush that felt thick and tangled to me. My heart was racing so hard I was afraid the sound alone would give me away. I started to move again, inch by inch. My steps were slow, controlled, almost painful in how careful they were. I never turned my back to it. I kept the bear in my vision as long as I could, watching for any change in its movement. It never charged. It never stopped. It just kept walking, slowly increasing the distance between us until it disappeared behind the trees. The moment I lost sight of it, the fear did not leave. If anything, it got worse. Now I did not know where it was. I kept moving, faster now, but still trying not to make noise. The trail felt endless. Every sound behind me made my muscles tense. I imagined heavy footsteps, imagined the snap of branches growing closer. When I reached the meadow, something in my brain finally snapped. The open space felt like safety, even though I knew it was not guaranteed. I broke into a run. I did not care about noise anymore. I ran as hard as I could, lungs burning, legs shaking, fear pushing me forward. The 2 miles back to my car felt like 10. I did not slow down until I reached the parking area. When I got to my car, my hand was shaking so badly it took me a moment to unlock the door. I threw my pack in the back, got inside, and locked the doors immediately. I sat there for a few seconds, breathing hard, scanning the tree line. Then I started the engine and left as fast as I could. I did not stop. I did not look back. I drove to a more crowded area of the park and stayed there for the rest of the day, surrounded by other hikers, pretending everything was fine. But the feeling stayed with me long after I left the park. That experience changed how I felt about quiet places. I told myself it was just nature being nature, that I had handled it the right way, but something about it stayed lodged in my chest. The memory of that growl, the weight of that presence in the trees, never really faded. Sometime later, that same sense of unease came back in a very different place. My friend and I went to Secret Sidewalk in Niles Canyon, an old aqueduct tucked away from the main roads. It was one of those places that feels forgotten, like it slipped through the cracks of time. Concrete walls stained dark with age, graffiti fading under layers of dust and moss. The air was still and smelled like damp earth and rust. We climbed up to the aqueduct and walked along it, our footsteps echoing softly against the concrete. The canyon around us felt closed in, the walls rising steep and uneven. The city had started demolishing part of the aqueduct years ago, and broken sections lay scattered like bones. We walked to the end, took a few pictures, and started heading back toward where we had climbed up. As we walked, the quiet felt heavy again. Not peaceful, but loaded. I felt that same tightness in my chest, the same sense that something was off. The sound of our footsteps seemed too loud in the narrow space. The trees and brush along the canyon walls felt closer than they should have been. Then we heard it. Loud rustling, branches snapping, leaves being crushed with force. It came from the brush nearby, close enough that the sound vibrated through the ground. We stopped moving instantly. Every muscle in my body tensed. I stared into the trees, trying to make sense of the noise. It was too heavy to be something small, too violent to be the wind. My mind ran through possibilities and rejected each one. There are no large animals known to hang out there. It did not sound like a person either. The movement was wrong for that, too powerful, too uncontrolled. The rustling continued for a few seconds that felt stretched thin, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. My skin felt hot and cold at the same time. I did not move. I did not breathe any more than I had to. Eventually, nothing else happened. No shape emerged. No sound followed. After a long moment, we slowly started moving again, every step cautious, eyes locked on the brush. We did not linger. We did not explore further. We climbed down and left the area without looking back. When I think about those two experiences, what stays with me is not just the fear in the moment, but how clear everything felt afterward. There was no mystery, no explanation needed beyond the simple truth that there are places where humans do not belong, at least not fully. In Lassen, it was a bear, a real animal doing what animals do. In Niles Canyon, it was something unseen but still real, something heavy moving through a place that hides more than it shows. I made it back both times. I drove away. I went home. Nothing followed me. But those moments taught me something I cannot forget. Sometimes fear is not imagination or overthinking. Sometimes it is a warning. And when your body tells you that you are not alone, even in places that seem harmless, it is usually right. A few years ago, we decided to hike up to the abandoned zoo in Los Angeles late at night. There were 7 of us, all grown men, bored and full of that stupid confidence you get when you think nothing can really touch you. The plan was simple. We wanted to scare ourselves. We wanted that tight feeling in the chest, the rush, the kind of night you talk about later and laugh at. None of us treated it like something serious. It was just a place on a map that everyone said felt wrong after dark. We parked far from any main road and started the hike just as the sky was losing its last bit of color. The canyon swallowed sound in a strange way. At first it felt calm, almost peaceful. The dirt trail was dry and dusty, and every step kicked up a soft crunch under our shoes. The smell of sage and dry brush hung in the air. We joked around in our own heads, feeling brave just for being there, but outwardly we were quiet. Not because we were scared yet, but because the place made you lower your voice without thinking. The first half of the hike was uneventful. We saw small animals dart across the trail, quick shapes moving low to the ground. Their eyes caught our light for a split second, and then they were gone. An owl flew overhead at one point, silent except for the rush of air from its wings. That was probably the creepiest thing early on, not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded us how little noise things need to make out there. As we climbed higher, the city lights fell away behind us. The trail narrowed and twisted along the side of the canyon. The ground dropped off sharply to one side, and the wall of rock and dirt pressed close on the other. Our flashlights started to flicker not long after that. We had brought old gear, stuff that had been sitting around for a while. At the time, it didn't feel important. Batteries die. It happens. We shrugged it off and switched to our phone lights when needed. The air felt different the farther we went. Not colder exactly, just heavier. The kind of air that makes you breathe slower without realizing it. Sweat cooled on my back, and my shirt stuck to my skin. The trail signs are gone by then. It felt like we were moving into a space that wasn't meant for foot traffic anymore. Around the 3-quarter mark, the path narrowed so much that we had to move single file. Our shoulders brushed the canyon wall, and our feet felt for solid ground with each step. One wrong move would have meant sliding down into darkness. The rock beside us was rough and gritty, scraping against our clothes. I was fourth in line, close enough to see the movements of the guys ahead of me, close enough to feel their hesitation when it came. Then the guy in front stopped. At first I thought he had lost his footing. The line behind him tightened. Nobody spoke, but the pause stretched too long. I leaned forward, trying to see past the curve of the trail. About 2 seconds later, my light caught what he was staring at. A man was walking toward us. He was dressed completely in white. Not bright, clean white, but a dull, chalky white like fabric that had been washed too many times and coated in dust. His hair was white. He wore a white top hat that sat stiff and straight on his head. His clothes looked old-fashioned in a way that didn't feel like costume. Loose, simple, practical. He looked like someone who had been walking these hills for a long time. The strangest part was how easily he moved. The path was so narrow that we were turned sideways just to fit. Our backs pressed against the canyon wall. Our toes were pointed toward open air. Yet he walked straight through the path like it was wide and flat. His steps were steady, calm, like he knew every inch of the ground. As he passed us, his face was partly covered, not masked, just hidden by the angle of his hat and the way he kept his head slightly down. He did not look at us. He did not slow down. He did not react in any way that showed surprise at seeing 7 people pressed against the canyon wall in the dark. My body reacted before my mind did. My chest tightened. My hand shook so badly I had to grip my phone with both of them. I remember thinking how stupid all our confidence felt in that moment. How thin it was. How fast it disappeared. I had never felt that kind of fear from a person before. Not panic, not danger, just a deep sense that something was very wrong. He smelled like dust and dry earth as he passed. The kind of smell you get when you kick up dirt that hasn't been touched in years. His clothes brushed close enough that I could see the texture of the fabric. It was real. He was real. Once he was past US, none of us moved right away. The sound of his footsteps faded into the dark behind us. The canyon seemed to breathe again. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to cry, not because I thought we were going to die, but because I didn't understand what I had just seen. We didn't need to agree on anything. We turned around and started back the way we came. Slowly at first, then faster once the trail widened. The idea of continuing didn't even exist anymore. Whatever we thought we were looking for, we had found enough. The hike back felt longer than the way up. Every sound made my shoulders tense. Every shadow looked deeper. The canyon no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. When we finally reached the lower part of the trail and the ground leveled out, my legs felt weak with relief. When we got back to the car, the night felt different again. The open space of the parking area should have made me feel safe, but instead it felt exposed. As we got closer, we noticed small lights moving around the car. Fast, circular movements like tiny sparks. They weren't steady. They zipped and curved, catching the light and then disappearing. At first my mind jumped to something impossible, but then I forced myself to look harder. The lights were close to the ground. They moved in quick bursts. When our headlights hit them, they vanished. Bugs, dust, maybe moisture in the air catching the light just right. The kind of thing you don't notice until your nerves are shot and your brain is looking for threats. Once we unlocked the car and got inside, the lights were gone. The doors closed with solid, normal sounds. The engine started without trouble. The radio came on. Everything worked the way it should. The drive home was quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet, but the heavy kind where everyone is lost in their own thoughts. I kept replaying the image of that man in white, not as something supernatural, but as a reminder that places like that attract people who live outside normal rules. Someone who knew those trails better than we did. Someone who moved through the dark like it belonged to him. By the time we hit the main road and the city lights surrounded us again, my fear had settled into something colder and more lasting. Respect, not for the abandoned zoo itself, but for how quickly things can shift when you step into places you don't understand. I have never gone back, not because I believe in ghosts or curses, but because I learned something that night. Fear doesn't always come from things that aren't real. Sometimes it comes from realizing how small you are in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with no control at all. That understanding stayed with me long after the canyon disappeared in the rearview mirror. I remember that hike like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. My buddy and I were freshly graduated, 18, full of energy, full of that dumb confidence that makes you think nothing can go wrong. We decided, almost as a joke to ourselves at first, to tackle the Tanner Trail in the Grand Canyon. Everyone said it was brutal, not just physically, but mentally too, and the stories about the landslide that had partially wiped it out made it even more tempting. We didn't care about warnings. We just wanted the challenge. We wanted to prove something to ourselves. Or maybe we just wanted to do something stupid and extreme before real life started. It was late June, which meant the sun was already a heavy, oppressive thing even before we descended far into the canyon. I had never felt heat like that before. The air shimmering, radiating from the red rocks, making the ground underfoot almost unbearable to touch. By the time we were halfway down, our water packs were getting light, our skin was sunburned in places we didn't realize could burn, and even breathing felt like dragging air through an oven. The trail itself was treacherous, narrow ledges, loose scree, and the occasional sudden drop that made you think twice about every step. The rocks beneath our boots weren't just rough, they seemed alive in the heat, radiating back everything the sun put in. We were exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but there was this sense of achievement that pushed us forward. We joked at first, sarcastically calling ourselves warriors of the canyon. But even the jokes dried up eventually because the canyon has a way of making you feel tiny, completely insignificant. The silence was oppressive, not the kind you think of as peaceful, but the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every tiny shift in the wind. I don't think we saw a single other human the entire descent. The last stretch before the river was down a dry creek bed. I think it was Tanner Creek, though at the time I didn't care about the names. All I cared about was getting to water, shade, and a spot where we could finally collapse. The rocks there were jagged, and the sun was directly overhead, making the dust swirl around us. Our feet were sore, our legs trembling with every step, and our packs felt like they had been filled with lead. We rounded a bend, something in the dust flicking across our vision, and there he was. He was standing at the edge of the water, completely alone, and the first thing I noticed was how out of place he looked. He could have walked out of some old movie. Late 20s, early 30s, long black hair, denim shirt tucked neatly into jeans, and boots that looked like they had been worn for decades. He wasn't in the way of wild or threatening. He just looked intentional, purposeful, almost too composed for the wilderness around him. My first thought was that maybe he was some local who knew the canyon in ways we never could. But then we realized he wasn't doing anything ordinary. He was tossing a small racquetball into the rapids at the foot of the creek. He'd throw it out. It would hit a rock in the shallow water and would bounce right back to him. Over and over. He didn't acknowledge us. He didn't even glance our way. It was like he was in some world of his own. At first, we just watched, half amazed, half annoyed because we were too tired to engage with anyone. But the way he did it, it wasn't luck. The ball didn't just hit and bounce. He knew exactly how to do it. He had read the rocks, the current, the way the water twisted and turned. There was a rhythm to it that was hypnotic and almost impossible to ignore. We said hi as we passed, and he responded, not in words, but in that simple acknowledgement of our existence. He walked downstream, and we went upstream, searching for a place to camp before the sun went completely down. The whole encounter felt surreal, like a fragment of a dream stuck in the middle of our exhausting hike. We never saw him again. It wasn't until later, lying in the tent that night, that I realized how strange it was. How could someone casually play with the river like that without spilling a drop of skill or knowledge? How could he know that one precise combination of rocks and current that made the ball behave that way? Night fell fast in the canyon. There's no city light to fight the darkness, no soft glow from roads. Just black sky, deep and endless. The Colorado River moved below us, its sound magnified, echoing off the canyon walls. Every little crack of stone or rustle of wind became something that made you jump. I couldn't sleep. My buddy tried, but I could see him tossing and turning. The heat during the day had been exhausting, but the night brought its own kind of tension. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe it was the image of that man and his impossible little trick with the ball. The canyon had swallowed him and returned to silence, as if he had never existed. We woke before sunrise, stiff, sore, and weary of the long climb back out. We moved slowly, methodical. Every step had to be considered because the canyon doesn't forgive mistakes, and the heat was already rising again. The water we had left was almost gone, and the climb made it feel like the air itself was resisting us. By the time we reached the first lookout above the river, the view opened up into something vast and brutal. The walls of the canyon stretched endlessly, the Colorado threading silver through the bottom, sparkling in the sun. I looked around, half expecting to see him there again, standing by the edge with the ball. But the canyon had no trace of him. The hike back to the rim was a slow trudge. We were careful, calculating each step, each pause for breath, and the weight of the experience settled on us. That man at the bottom of the canyon wasn't scary in the traditional sense. He didn't threaten us, he didn't attack us, and he didn't vanish into some supernatural mist. But there was something primal about him, something that made you recognize how little you actually knew about the world around you. The skill, the confidence, the absolute understanding of the environment. It was terrifying in its own way because it reminded me how unprepared we were for the canyon, for nature, and for anything that demanded respect. By the time we finally emerged at the trailhead, drenched in sweat and covered in dust, I felt a kind of relief I've rarely felt before or since. We made it out alive. That's the thing about experiences like that. You remember not just the physical challenge, but the small moments that stick in your mind, the encounters that make you question how the world works. I still think about that man. How did he know that tiny trick with the ball? Was it luck? Skill? Instinct? Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is the lesson of the canyon. The wilderness doesn't care about you. It doesn't owe you anything, and it rewards only those who understand it deeply, who respect it fully. Years later, I've hiked other places, faced other challenges, but nothing compares to Tanner Trail. Nothing compares to that day in the canyon. And sometimes when I hear the sound of water bouncing off rocks, I swear I can see him tossing that ball into the rapids, calm, composed, part of the canyon itself, reminding me in the quietest, simplest way that there are forces in the world we'll never fully understand, and that sometimes surviving is the only victory we need. We left the canyon different than we arrived, more careful, more aware, and strangely humbled. That hike could have broken us, but it didn't. It taught us something we never could have learned from books or classrooms or movies. Respect the canyon, respect the heat, respect the power of nature, and understand that some encounters leave marks not because of fear, but because of awe. And that night, even though sleep eluded us, I realized I was okay. Alive, wiser, and carrying a story I'd never forget. When I was younger, my family had a camp deep in the outskirts of Powers, Michigan. It was a hand-built log cabin, rough and sturdy, with a roof that had seen more winters than I could count. There was no indoor plumbing, no electricity, just the basics, a wood stove, a generator we barely used, and a few propane lanterns. It was mainly used for hunting trips, but one year my dad decided we would spend our spring break there, thinking it would be a good way for all of us to disconnect from the world. I was excited at first, imagining the snow melting, the forest smells, the quiet. I hadn't realized just how isolating it would feel. The cabin was small but tall. The main floor had the kitchen area, the wood stove, and a rough-hewn living space with a table and chairs that had probably been salvaged from old barns. The loft above was where we all slept. It was just an open space with a low railing along the edge, and we had 5 beds scattered around, old twin mattresses with warm blankets. I was on one of the beds near the center, sandwiched between my sister and my dad, who both had the kind of heavy snore that seemed to shake the walls. I could barely focus on my iPod Nano, playing the same old games I'd memorized the controls for years ago. The first couple of nights were normal, just the creaks and pops of a log cabin settling. But on the third night, things started to feel off. I was lying there, earbuds in, eyes heavy, letting the monotony of a game lull me towards sleep when it began, a loud buzzing sound, low at first, then rising in intensity. It shook the walls. My initial thought was a plane, though the nearest airport was miles away, or maybe the generator had turned on by itself. I looked toward the skylight, the only glass in the loft, expecting to see the blur of a distant aircraft. What I saw instead froze me. It wasn't an object. It was a flash of color unlike anything I had ever seen. It reminded me of a transformer exploding. If you've ever seen that sort of rapid rainbow flicker, that's exactly what it looked like. But this wasn't a flash for an instant. It was a full coating over the skylight, like someone had spilled oil across it, shimmering and shifting, moving closer as if it were alive. The buzzing vibrated through my chest, rattling my teeth, making the hair on my arms stand on end. My heart pounded so hard I was sure my dad would wake from the sound, but his snores continued, oblivious. I panicked. Instinctively, I grabbed the nearest pillow and flung it at my dad. The moment it hit his shoulder, the colors vanished, and the buzzing stopped. The skylight was just clear glass again, moonlight spilling through as if nothing had happened. I froze, my mind racing. It had to be my imagination, some trick of the light or a reflection, but it felt too real, too intense to be a hallucination. And we were in the middle of nowhere. There were no power lines, no neon signs, no possibility of a car or plane close enough to make that kind of sound. The rest of that night was impossible to sleep through. I kept my eyes on the skylight, straining in the darkness, half expecting it to return. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind through the trees, sounded amplified. The forest outside pressed against the cabin in a way that felt suffocating, the shadows stretching and shifting as if they were alive. The next morning, my dad suggested we take a hike to shake off the cabin blues. I agreed silently, though my mind kept replaying the colors and the vibration, the way it felt like the walls themselves were humming. The hike didn't help much. The forest was silent, too silent, with only the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of a deer in the brush. I kept thinking about the skylight, about how that color had moved closer and then vanished. It didn't make sense. I started rationalizing, thinking maybe a meteor, maybe some kind of atmospheric reflection, but the buzzing, it had felt like it was inside the cabin, not outside. And it had disappeared instantly the moment I threw the pillow. That detail stuck with me because it suggested a responsiveness, a cause and effect that no natural phenomenon I knew of could match. That night, I couldn't stay in a loft. I moved my sleeping bag to the floor near the wood stove, onto the slope of the ceiling where I could barely see the skylight. I wanted to feel grounded, to be closer to the warmth and the smell of burning wood. But the anxiety didn't leave me. I lay awake, counting the seconds between the wind gusts and every distant sound, feeling the old cabin settle and shift. At some point, I drifted off, but the feeling that something extraordinary, inexplicable had happened never left me. The next day, I investigated the skylight more closely. It was just glass, slightly dirty from years of dust and pollen, with no scratches or cracks that could have caused light to refract in strange ways. There were no remnants of anything unusual, no residue, no mark on the cabin roof. Nothing. I tried to find explanations online when I got back home. Auroras, weather phenomena, rare insect swarms, but nothing matched what I had seen. Nothing made sense, and I kept coming back to the detail that it vanished the instant I acted. Over the years, I told a few friends, trying to see if anyone had experienced something similar. Some suggested sleep paralysis. Some said it could have been a reflection from the iPod screen. Others insisted it was just my imagination fueled by the isolation of the forest. But I knew the difference. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't hallucinating. I had been wide awake, alert, aware of every detail. The buzzing, the vibration, the rainbow flash, and the sudden disappearance. It left a mark on me, an unease I still feel when I'm alone in remote areas. Now, looking back, I've come to a sort of conclusion, though it's not definitive. I think it may have been a rare atmospheric or electrical phenomenon, something caused by a combination of conditions, perhaps moisture, ice crystals in the air, static electricity building up on the metal roof of the cabin. But whatever it was one of the most vivid and intense experiences of my life. It was terrifying, surreal, and completely real. I don't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but that doesn't mean my senses were wrong. Sometimes the world just has things in it that we don't understand yet. I still visit Powers every few years, usually to hike or hunt, and I never go near that cabin at night anymore. During the day, it feels like any other place, quiet and isolated but harmless. At night, though, I can't shake the memory of that skylight and the way the cabin seemed to hum under that impossible flash of color. I made peace with it in my own way. It was something rare, something beyond ordinary life, but entirely natural in its own way. The world is bigger and stranger than we often realize, and sometimes all you can do is acknowledge it, respect it, and keep going. The experience doesn't haunt me in a terrifying way anymore. It reminds me to pay attention, to notice the small anomalies, the things that seem out of place, because the world isn't always what it seems. I've learned to carry that awareness without fear, knowing that some mysteries are meant to be remembered, not solved. And in that, there's a kind of peace. I've slept many nights since then under open skies, in cabins, in tents, and even under bridges. And though I sometimes think of the Powers cabin, the memory has shifted from terror to a quiet reminder of how vast and strange the world can be. It ended in that realization, that the experience, while unnerving, didn't harm me, didn't follow me, didn't threaten me. It was simply an encounter with something I could not yet explain, and that in itself was enough to change the way I see the world. I have been itching to take my boyfriend camping for months. Not just anywhere, but up in the MT Adams area, the Gifford Pinchot Forest. I had heard whispers about strange UFO activity there, lights that zipped across the sky in impossible patterns, things that even people who didn't believe in extraterrestrial life couldn't easily explain. My boyfriend, bless him, was the type to roll his eyes at anything remotely paranormal. Skeptical to the bone, the kind of guy who would find a logical explanation for a shadow in a closet. That made him the perfect challenge, at least in my mind. I wanted him to see what I'd seen before. I wanted him to experience it without me trying to convince him. Just raw, unexplained phenomena. We packed up the car, the usual camping gear, tent, sleeping bags, lanterns, food that would last a few days. The drive up was long, winding through roads that clung to the edges of mountains, flanked by thick forest that was already starting to darken as the sun slipped behind the peaks. I could see him squinting out the window, the way people do when they're not entirely sure they believe what you're telling them. I smiled to myself, anticipating the moment he'd be forced to admit that some things couldn't just be explained away. We set up camp in a dispersed spot that gave us a wide view of the sky. Nothing but trees behind us, the stars starting to prick through the darkening blue. It was quiet in the forest, almost unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that settles over you and makes your own movement seem loud. I knew this spot was good. I had been here before, had watched lights appear and vanish in ways that defied logic. I was hoping for a repeat. The night stayed calm at first, the usual sounds of crickets and distant rustling. Then the first light appeared, small and bright, hovering where no aircraft should have been. My heart skipped a beat, and I watched him turn toward it, eyes narrowing. The light zipped suddenly, impossibly fast, then vanished. Another appeared, then joined with the first, forming patterns I couldn't explain. It was mesmerizing, and finally he said it, the words I've been waiting for. Yeah, I have no idea what that was. Satisfaction surged through me. Even a super skeptic could admit when something didn't make sense. We watched for hours, the lights appearing and disappearing, joining up, splitting apart, moving in ways no helicopter or plane could manage. Nothing else happened. No eerie sounds, no strange figures. Just the lights, the quiet, the crisp night air that smelled of pine and earth. By the time we packed up the next morning, he was quiet, thoughtful, a rare sight for him. I could tell he was processing what he had just witnessed. A few months later, we went camping again, this time with his dad and stepdad, both of whom were longtime veterans in the Forest Service and BLM. Their experience with the wilderness far surpassed anything I had encountered, and their presence made me feel both safe and small in the vastness of the forest. Somehow, our previous conversation about UFOs and strange lights came up, and I mentioned the spots we had camped. Without any prompting, his stepdad, the one who was usually practical to a fault and dismissed things like UFOs as nonsense, said, "We were supposed to be up there looking for camp thieves. We never caught any thieves, but we saw a lot of weird stuff in the sky." I pressed for details, trying to gauge how much he would actually share, but he got a little cagey. What he did reveal, though, was enough to make my stomach tighten. He told a story about huge black logging trucks with no lights that would appear in the forest and steal lumber in the middle of the night. He and his partner had staked out one night to catch them. They had to back into the brush, hide completely, sit in absolute silence so the truck couldn't detect them with heat or night vision. The forest behind them stretched endlessly, nothing but trees and shadows. After over an hour of waiting in near total darkness, he said, huge lights appeared behind them, coming from deep within the forest. They were so bright that he could see the entire outline of the truck, its antenna, the spotlights, the figures of his partner and himself in stark shadow. This was the early 80s, long before LEDs and ultra-bright portable lights. These were not ordinary lights. The glow was unnatural, intense, and just as suddenly as they appeared, they went out. Silence swallowed everything again. No engine noise, no forest rustling, no evidence the truck was even there. He had never seen anything like it before or since. Hearing him tell it, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The way he spoke made it clear he wasn't exaggerating. The details were too precise, too consistent with someone who had actually experienced it. My boyfriend, the guy I had already shown the sky lights to, was quiet, absorbing every word, and I realized the story had shaken even him. Later, I did some digging on my own, reading through old Forest Service reports and accounts from rangers in that area during the early 80s. There were scattered mentions of strange lights, of inexplicable phenomena in the forest, and even reports of lumber disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Nothing fully explained it, of course. Nothing made sense. The forest had a history, a quiet record of things that didn't fit neatly into logic. We stayed a few more nights in different areas of the MT Adams forest. Every night, I would watch the stars, the way the shadows fell across the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed by something unseen. Not malicious, not threatening in a traditional sense, but aware. The forest had a presence that was impossible to define. The lights never appeared again while we were there, but the memory of what his stepdad had seen lingered like a shadow over our trip. By the end of the trip, I felt a strange satisfaction. There was no dramatic confrontation, no climactic event in the forest. Just the understanding that some things in this world, some things in the vast stretches of wilderness, some things in the night sky, exist outside human understanding. You could witness them, you could record them, you could describe them, but comprehension would always fall short. That reality didn't make the forest or the lights any less real. It made it more terrifying, more fascinating. Driving home, I glanced at my boyfriend, who had gone back to his usual quiet, practical self. But I could see in his eyes something had shifted. The skeptic inside him had been rattled, forced to admit that the universe was far stranger than he had ever imagined. And for me, I felt a calm certainty that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be witnessed, stored in memory, and respected. The forest behind us grew smaller in the rearview mirror, dark green, fading into the distance. But the memory of those lights, of the silence after the glow vanished, and of the truck that may or may not have been there, stayed with me. Real, unexplainable, terrifying in its quiet logic. It was a part of the wilderness now, a truth I carried with me, a story I would never forget. And in that, I found a kind of peace. It wasn't about proving anything or capturing proof. It was about understanding that the world was far larger, far stranger, and far more alive than any skeptic could ever imagine. We returned home with our gear, our minds buzzing, hearts heavier with knowledge we couldn't fully explain. I knew we'd go back someday. There was a pull, a gravity in that forest, in the MT Adams area, that promised more mysteries. And I would be ready. Not for a dramatic encounter, not for a story to tell, just to watch, to experience, and to remember that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones you can't explain, the ones that don't make sense, and the ones that exist quietly, just out of reach of your understanding. The forest keeps its secrets, but I learned that night that some secrets are real, and that's more terrifying and more beautiful than anything a skeptic could ever imagine. I had been looking forward to my 13th birthday for months, and when the day finally arrived, my parents let me go camping with a few of my closest friends in Okanagan Falls, British Columbia. The plan was simple, a long weekend of swimming, hiking, and sitting around the campfire under the stars. The lake we were camping near was calm and wide, with a sandy shore that glimmered in the late afternoon sun. I remember the warmth of the sun on my shoulders as my friends and I ran into the water, the coolness of the lake wrapping around us like a soft blanket. The feeling was freeing, and for a while, I felt like nothing could touch me. The day was perfect in that way that makes you forget the world outside, the kind of perfection that sneaks up and lingers in your chest like a quiet happiness. After swimming for a while, we decided to head back to the campsite. The trail followed the river for a few hundred meters, winding around thick patches of trees and overgrown brush. The river had a decent current, and just downstream there was a small dam, a concrete structure with turbines that churned the water into an almost violent rush. I had read the warning signs as a kid whenever our family drove past this area. There had been a tragedy here a few years before. 2 brothers had drowned trying to play near the turbines. The town had marked the dam with skull and crossbones signs, and large letters screamed danger. The story had haunted me in the back of my mind as we walked along the river, and I felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. My friends seemed oblivious to it, laughing and joking as they skipped over rocks and patches of dry grass along the trail. The light was fading, the sun sinking behind the hills, casting the water in a muted gold and shadowy blue. Everything around the river seemed quieter, softer somehow, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw him. I was maybe 10 meters ahead of my friends, my eyes scanning the river when a movement caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a reflection of the sun or maybe a trick of the water, but then I realized it was a figure, a boy, standing on the surface of the river itself. His form was impossibly clear and bright, as if light was radiating from him, a stark contrast against the darkening water and shadows of the trees. He looked like he belonged to the world, but at the same time, he seemed completely separate, untouched by the water below. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought my friends might hear it, and for a second, I could barely breathe. The boy was portly, maybe my age or a little younger, with indistinct features that made him more an image than a person. He walked slowly, carefully, about 10 meters across the water, his movements calm and deliberate. I don't think he ever blinked or moved his head. He was just there, moving forward, entirely self-contained. I called out to my friends, gesturing for them to look, my voice shaking. One of them glanced over, her eyes widening, and she whispered. Though I could hear her clearly, she saw him too. The other friend immediately covered her face and said she couldn't look, and I understood perfectly. Something about it made you both want to watch and want to look away at the same time. There was a pull to it, an undeniable strangeness that rooted us to the ground. We watched for what felt like several minutes, though in reality, it was probably closer to 2 or 3. The boy moved slowly, and each step created a tiny ripple that glimmered in the fading sunlight. It was mesmerizing, hypnotic, almost, the way he moved across the river. It didn't seem possible, and yet there he was. I couldn't explain it, and even now I struggle to find words that fully capture the sense of impossibility in that moment. As he reached the end of the stretch, he began to fade, the bright white form dissolving slowly until there was nothing but the water moving as it always had, nothing but the murmur of the river and the distant rustle of trees. The moment he disappeared, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Relief because the encounter was so unnerving, and disappointment because it felt like a secret I'd stumbled upon, a world briefly opened and then closed before me. I looked at my friends, their expressions a mix of fear and wonder. We didn't speak. There were no words that could make sense of it, no reassurance that could explain what we had just seen. We turned and walked back to the campsite, the air around us thick with the residue of what had happened. Even the birds and insects seemed quieter, as if the forest itself was trying to process what it had witnessed. Back at the campsite, the world felt brighter, safer, more ordinary. The lake was calm, the fire pit still cold, and the tents in neat little rows, ordinary and familiar. We tried to return to our usual birthday celebrations, roasting marshmallows, playing games, laughing at stories, and teasing one another. But none of it felt quite the same. There was a quiet tension under our laughter, a shared understanding that we had seen something that didn't belong to the everyday world. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the crickets and the gentle rush of the river nearby, I thought about the boy on the water. I replayed every detail, the brightness of him, the calmness of his steps, the way the world seemed to hold its breath around him. I felt a strange connection to him, a fleeting sense that he had existed in that space for a reason, that somehow he had appeared to warn, remind, or simply be witnessed. In the morning, everything seemed ordinary again. The sun rose over the lake, shimmering across the water in a way that reminded me of the boy. We packed our things and left the campsite, the events of the previous evening already beginning to feel dreamlike. Over the years, I have thought about that day constantly. I've tried to rationalize it in every way I could. Reflections, tricks of light, hallucinations, shared imagination, but nothing fits completely. The memory is too vivid, too anchored in the physical world for it to be dismissed entirely. I know what I saw, and even though I cannot explain it, I'm grateful that I witnessed it. The encounter left a mark, but not a frightening one. It changed the way I see the ordinary, the way I move through the world. It reminded me that there are moments and experiences that defy explanation, moments where reality stretches and bends for reasons we may never understand. Every time I return to that river, or even think about it, I feel a calm certainty that what I saw was real, not imagined. The boy walking on the water was a moment of impossible clarity, a rare and silent reminder that the world is bigger than what we can explain, but also, somehow, that it can be beautiful in ways that are quiet, subtle, and fleeting. And that day, my 13th birthday, remains forever etched in my memory, not just for the celebration, but for the encounter that reminded me that even the most ordinary places can hold extraordinary moments. I was on a backpacking trip in a Manistee National Forest with my Boy Scout troop, several miles deep in the woods, far enough that the road noise and any sign of normal life had completely faded away. I was still young, old enough to carry my own pack and think I knew what the woods were about, but not old enough to really understand how different things sound once the sun goes down and you're surrounded by nothing but trees. We had hiked most of the day along sandy trails that twisted through tall pines and hardwoods. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in needles and leaves, and the air smelled like damp earth and sap. By the time we reached our campsite, my legs ached and my shoulders felt raw from the straps of my pack. The campsite was a small clearing just off the trail, nothing special. A few flat spots for tents, a fire ring made of old stones, and logs dragged into rough benches by past groups. As the light faded, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees looked taller and closer together, their dark shapes stacking on top of each other. We moved through our routine quickly, setting up tents, hanging food bags, and getting ready for bed. There was a sense of excitement mixed with tiredness, the kind you only feel when you are deep in the woods and know you are staying the night. Once everyone was zipped into their tents, the forest settled into its nighttime rhythm. At first it was calm. I could hear the wind moving high up in the trees, the soft creak of branches, and the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I lay on my sleeping pad, staring up at the dark fabric of the tent, listening to my own breathing, feeling the ground beneath me. That was when the noises started. It began with a long, sharp sound that cut through the quiet like a blade. It was high-pitched and stretched out, rising and falling in a way that made my skin tighten. Then another sound answered it from farther away, and then another. They echoed through the trees, bouncing off the trunks and rolling through the darkness. It did not sound like anything I had heard before, at least not in real life. It was not a simple howl or bark. It was layered, almost frantic, like something was being chased or something was calling out in panic. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and strained to listen. The sounds came in waves. Sometimes they were close enough that I felt like they were just beyond the edge of the clearing. Other times they faded into the distance, only to rise again from a different direction. Screams, shrieks, and sharp calls blended together, overlapping in a way that made it impossible to tell how many animals there were or where exactly they were moving. My heart pounded, and I remember thinking that the woods felt suddenly crowded, like there were eyes everywhere. Then came a sound that really shook me. It was a deep, solid crack, loud and sudden, like a baseball bat being swung as hard as possible against a tree trunk. It echoed once, and then disappeared, leaving a heavy silence behind it. A few seconds later, another crack sounded, just as strong, from a different direction. Each time it happened, my body tensed, waiting for something else to follow. Sometimes the screaming sounds would pick back up afterward. Sometimes they would stop completely, leaving only the normal night noises and my own breathing. Time stretched in a strange way that night. I had no idea how long it went on. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Every time I thought it was over, another shriek or another sharp crack would rip through the darkness. I lay there, imagining shapes moving between the trees, imagining large animals running just out of sight. I told myself over and over that this was just the forest, that animals make noise, that there was a logical reason for everything. But logic is hard to hold on to when you are alone in a tent, surrounded by sounds you do not understand. Eventually, the noises faded. Not all at once, but slowly, like a storm moving away. The screams became more distant. The cracks stopped entirely, and the forest returned to its steady, nighttime hum. I did not sleep much after that. When I did drift off, it was shallow and broken, filled with half dreams and the constant expectation that the noises would start again. Morning came with gray light filtering through the trees. The forest looked harmless again, almost peaceful. Birds called from above, and the air was cool and fresh. When I crawled out of my tent, everything looked exactly the same as it had the night before. No broken branches nearby, no obvious signs of animals passing through camp. The ground was undisturbed except for our own footprints. What struck me most was how quiet everyone was. Normally, mornings on a trip were full of noise, people talking, laughing, complaining about sore muscles. That morning, there was very little of that. People moved slowly, packing up gear, avoiding eye contact. It felt like everyone was thinking about the same thing, but no one wanted to be the first to bring it up. The only acknowledgement came from the assistant scoutmaster, who brushed it off as unusual animal sounds, something he claimed to have heard before. There was no detailed explanation, no real discussion. Just a simple attempt to put a name to the noise and move on. We continued along the trail later that day, the forest stretching on endlessly around us. As we hiked, I kept looking into the trees, half expecting to see something watching us. Every snapped twig made me jump. At one point, we passed a solo hiker heading the opposite direction. He looked tired and annoyed, and he stopped to get our leader's attention. From his body language and tone, it was clear he had been disturbed by something during the night. He gestured back down the trail, clearly upset, and I could tell he was talking about noise, about being kept awake. He even mimed shouting into the woods, as if trying to make something stop. Our leader responded calmly, and after a short exchange, the man shook his head and continued on his way. The look on his face stuck with me. It was the look of someone who had experienced something they did not expect and did not enjoy. Years passed, life moved on, and the memory of that night faded into the background, becoming just another strange story filed away in my mind. Then one night, while browsing online, I came across a video recorded in the Manistee National Forest. The title mentioned strange noises. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on it. As soon as the audio started, my stomach dropped. The sounds were painfully familiar. The same high-pitched screams, the same layered calls echoing through the trees. Even the sharp cracking noises were there, loud and sudden. I learned later that coyotes can make a wide range of sounds, especially when in groups. Their calls can echo and overlap, creating the illusion of something much larger or more numerous. I also learned that trees can make loud cracking noises at night due to temperature changes, falling limbs, or even animals hitting them while running or fighting. Bucks striking trees with their antlers during the rut can produce a sharp, hollow crack that carries a long way in still air. Taken separately, each explanation made sense. What stayed with me was how all of it came together that night. The timing, the intensity, the way it lasted so long, and the fact that another person miles away had been just as disturbed by it. The forest had done nothing supernatural. It had simply been the forest being itself, loud and raw and unconcerned with how it made people feel. The ending of that experience, for me, is not fear, but respect. I understand now that the woods are not quiet places, even when they seem calm. They are full of life, conflict, and movement, most of it hidden until nightfall. That night in Manistee taught me that there are sounds out there that do not fit neatly into our expectations, and that not understanding something does not make it unreal or magical. It makes it natural. I still think about that trip when I go into wooded areas, even now. I pay more attention. I listen more carefully. I do not assume that silence means safety or that noise means danger. I know that there are animals out there doing what they have always done, long before people set foot on those trails. The memory makes me cautious, but also keeps me grounded. Whatever was out there that night was real, flesh and bone and instinct, moving through the dark forest without any concern for the thin walls of a tent or the fear of a kid lying awake inside it. I was a stupid kid, somewhere between 13 and 16, the kind of kid who thought wanting something badly was the same as knowing what he was doing. I was fascinated with hunting, even though no one in my family hunted. No one taught me rules or seasons or respect beyond what you pick up from magazines and late night shows. I had the interest without the knowledge, and that is a bad mix for anyone, especially a kid alone in the woods. When I got my first BB gun, it felt like freedom in my hands. It was light, cheap, and probably weak compared to real guns, but to me it was powerful. It made me feel older and tougher than I was. I would sneak off into the woods behind our place whenever I could, telling myself I was scouting, learning the land, learning animals. In truth, I was just wandering around hoping something would happen, so I could feel important. The woods back there had a part everyone avoided. It dipped down into a swampy area where the ground stayed soft even in dry months. The trees were thinner there, crooked, with roots exposed like bones. In the middle of that swamp had once been an old farmhouse. When I was very young, maybe 2 or 3, it was still standing. I barely remembered it except for the shape of it and the way my parents would hurry me past. By the time I was old enough to roam on my own, there was nothing left but the stone foundation and a chimney that leaned slightly, like it was tired of standing. The place pulled at me. It felt like history, like something forgotten. I told myself animals would be drawn to it. That would be a good place to see wildlife. One evening near dusk, I decided to go there alone. I remember the light more than anything. The sun was low, and everything had that flat gray color where shadows stretch but details fade. The swamp smelled thick and wet, like old leaves and mud. Every step made a soft sucking sound, and I had to watch where I put my feet. I moved slow, not because I was careful, but because the place made me uneasy. The chimney rose out of the ground like a marker for a grave. The stones were dark with moisture, and moss filled the cracks. I stood near the edge of the foundation, looking around, listening. The woods were quiet in that way that feels heavy, not peaceful. No wind, no insects, just stillness. That was when I heard the wings. It was loud, much louder than I expected, a deep rushing sound that came from above and behind me. I looked up and saw a large bird land on the top of a dead tree, not far from the chimney. The tree had no leaves, just bare branches sticking out at odd angles. The bird's wings spread wide as it settled, and for a moment it blocked what little light was left. I could not see it clearly. Everything was gray and shadow. I could tell it was big, bigger than any bird I'd seen up close. Its body shape made me think of an owl or something like that. I did not stop to think about what kind. I did not think about laws or seasons or whether a BB gun could even kill it. I only thought about the fact that I was there, alone with a gun, and something was finally happening. I raised a BB gun and aimed. My hands were shaking a little, but I told myself that was excitement. I lined up the bird's shape against the dull sky and pulled the trigger. The bird dropped. It did not glide or flutter away. It fell straight down through the branches, hitting them on the way, and as it fell, it made a sound that I will never forget. It was a horrible screech, sharp and full of pain, not like any bird call I had heard before. It cut through the air and went right through me. The second I heard it, regret hit me hard. It was instant and heavy. I knew I had done something wrong, even if I did not fully understand what I had shot. Before I could even take a step forward or back, the woods exploded with sound. From every direction around me came screeching and howling. It rose all at once like a wave breaking. It was not one sound, but many layered together. Whooping, screeching, calling. It felt like it came from the trees themselves. I could hear it above me, beside me, behind me. It sounded like dozens, maybe hundreds of something answering at the same time. The closest way I can describe it is like 100 witches howling and whooping, but even that does not do it justice. It was wild and angry and alive. The noise pressed in on me. My chest tightened, and my heart started pounding so hard it hurt. I could not tell where the bird had fallen anymore. I could not tell where the sounds were coming from exactly, because they were everywhere. The swamp that had felt quiet seconds before now felt like it was closing in. I did not think. I turned and ran. I ran the way I came, splashing through mud, slipping, not caring if I fell. Branches scratched my face and arms. My breath came in short gasps, and my legs burned, but I did not slow down. The sounds followed me for a bit, not moving closer, but not fading right away either. It felt like the woods were watching me leave. The run home was about a quarter mile, but but it felt much longer. By the time I reached the edge of the woods near our place, the sounds had faded into the normal night noises. Crickets, distant frogs, things that felt small and familiar. I did not look back. I went straight inside, put the BB gun away, and sat there shaking until my breathing slowed. I did not tell anyone what happened. I did not go back to the swamp for a long time. Over the years, the memory dulled. It did not disappear completely, but it sank down, buried under other memories. I grew up. I learned more about nature the right way. I spent time outdoors with people who knew what they were doing. I learned respect the hard way, through mistakes and humility. I became an avid outdoorsman. I learned seasons, laws, and limits. I learned that hunting is not about taking, but about balance and responsibility. I learned to watch more than act. I would never shoot at something now unless it was legal, ethical, and meant to feed me or my family. That night in the swamp became a quiet lesson, even if I did not think about it often. Years later, as an adult, that memory came back suddenly. I do not know what triggered it. Maybe a smell, or a sound, or just a quiet moment when my mind wandered. It hit me with the same unease it had back then. I started looking things up, trying to make sense of it with adult knowledge. I listened to recordings of owl distress calls from my area. I read about birds that live in swamps and old farm sites. I tried to match the sounds I heard that night to something real. I cannot find anything that fit perfectly. That does not mean there is no explanation. Nature is wide and varied, and recordings never capture the full picture. A wounded bird can make sounds it normally would not. Other animals respond in ways that can overlap and echo, especially at dusk when many things become active at once. Sound travels strange in swamps, bouncing off water and trees. Fear also changes how the brain records things. I know all that now. Still, the memory stays unsettling. As for where I live now, I am in an apartment far from that swamp. Almost every other night, something feels off here. Not ghosts or anything like that. Just sounds, timing, the way stress and lack of sleep can twist normal things into something heavier. Pipes knock, floors creak, lights hum. The brain fills in gaps when it is tired and alone. I know that too. The difference is that now I do not run from it. I observe. I ground myself in what is real. I remind myself of what I learned as a kid, standing in the woods with a BB gun and no understanding. Fear does not always mean something unreal. Sometimes it is a reaction to crossing a line you did not know was there. That night in the swamp ended clearly for me. I ran home, learned a lesson, and grew into someone who respects the land instead of trying to conquer it. Whatever happened there stayed there. The woods did not follow me. The sound did not chase me beyond their place. They taught me, and they let me go. I still think about that night every time I look at a map of Ocala National Forest. It was supposed to be a normal hog hunt, the kind where you walk a lot, see nothing, and go home tired but satisfied. We went in late because that is when hogs move, and neither of us had work the next morning. The forest was quiet in that heavy Florida way, where the air feels thick even at night, and everything smells like pine needles, damp sand, and stagnant water hiding somewhere you cannot see. We parked off one of the dirt forest roads, the kind with deep ruts and soft sand that tries to pull your tires sideways if you're not careful. The car was alone, no other headlights, no glow from campfires, nothing. That part of the forest is big and empty, and once you step off the road, the darkness closes in fast. We checked our gear like we always did. Rifle slung, mags full, sidearms heavy on our hips, knives riding low where we could grab them without thinking. We had done this enough times that it felt routine, almost boring. The moon was high and bright enough that once your eyes adjusted, you could see the pale sand of the trails and the darker shapes of palmetto and scrub oak on either side. The logging roads cut the forest into big square blocks, straight lines through chaos, and we followed one of those roads deep inside. We kept moving, scanning for movement, listening for the sound of hogs rooting or snapping brush. Hours passed like that. No hogs, just insects, distant owls, and the constant awareness that you were far from anything resembling help. At some point, we realized we had gone farther than planned. It was not panic, just a quiet recognition that we were deep, 3 or 4 miles from the main road at least. The forest at night messes with your sense of distance. Everything looks the same after a while. Same trees, same sand, same walls of brush. We checked our direction and decided to walk out the most direct way instead of looping back around. That meant taking a thinner trail that cut across one of the quadrants instead of following the wide road all the way. We were not scared. That is important. We felt solid and prepared. Between the rifles, pistols, and lights, we felt like there was nothing in those woods that could surprise us. Black bears live there, but they avoid people. Deer are everywhere. Coyotes make noise, but keep their distance. People are rare that deep at night, and if someone was out there, we assumed they would be more scared of us than we were of them. The thin trail was barely a trail at all. It looked like an old cut that had almost been reclaimed by the forest. Palmetto fronds leaned in from both sides, brushing our legs as we walked. The sand was uneven, with roots pushing up through it. We moved slow, not because we were worried, but because it was easy to trip if you rushed. That was when we heard something moving fast through the woods to our right. Not a casual walk, not the slow, careful steps of a deer. It was crashing, heavy and careless, snapping branches and tearing through brush. It sounded like it was moving at an angle that would cross the trail ahead of us. We stopped without thinking, muscles tightening, senses sharpening. We listened. The sound got closer, still moving fast. I did not raise my rifle light. Instead, I brought up my handheld flashlight, the heavy one with a solid body that felt like a baton in my grip. I waited until the sound was almost on the trail, then I turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness and caught movement just as it crossed the trail about 50 feet ahead of us. All I saw were legs. Pale legs. Human legs. Bare from mid-thigh down, moving fast, and disappearing into the brush on the other side. For a moment, my brain refused to process it. It did not fit. A deer does not have legs like that. A bear does not move like that. And people do not run through thick Florida brush in the middle of the night wearing shorts, especially not miles from any road. We stood there listening. The crashing continued, but moved away, deeper into the forest. It did not circle back. It did not slow down. It just kept going until the sound faded into the distance. The woods went quiet again, like nothing had happened. The logical explanations started lining up in my head. Maybe it was some idiot camping illegally. Maybe someone was drunk or high and doing something stupid. Maybe we had spooked him and he ran. None of those explanations felt right, but they were better than letting my imagination get away from me. Turning back would have added a lot of time, and neither of us wanted to admit that one strange moment was enough to change our plan. We kept going. As we walked, every random sound stood out more than before. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, a sudden bird taking off. Each time, my body reacted before my mind could calm down. The forest felt closer, tighter, like it was pressing in around us. We heard movement off and on after that, always at a distance. Something pacing us, maybe just normal animals reacting to our presence. It never got close again. That almost made it worse. Whatever had crossed the trail did not want to be seen. Eventually, the trail widened and turned into the familiar logging road near where we had parked. When the car came into view, sitting exactly where we left it, a weight lifted off my chest that I had not realized was there. The car was untouched. No broken glass. No signs anyone had been near it. We kept our rifles ready anyway as we approached, scanning the darkness around the vehicle. We got in, closed the doors, and locked them. The inside of the car felt strangely small and fragile after hours in the open woods. I started the engine and pulled onto the road, the headlights carving a tunnel through the trees. I left the moonroof open. The sky above was clear and filled with stars, more than you ever see near towns or highways. For a moment, the beauty of it pushed the tension away. The forest looked calm again, almost peaceful. We drove slow, watching the edges of the road. About half a mile from where we parked, the headlights picked up a figure ahead of us. A man walking along the road. He was wearing a checkered button-down shirt and shorts. No backpack, no flashlight, no phone glowing in his hand. He was just walking, head slightly down, arms swinging loosely at his sides. The light washed over him as we passed, and he did not react. He did not turn his head. He did not flinch. He just kept walking forward like we were not there. My stomach dropped. The distance, the timing, the clothes, it all clicked into place at once. This was not a random camper wandering out from a nearby site. There were no cabins out there, no old homesteads, nothing. He was miles from a paved road, and even farther from any town. Walking alone at nearly 2 in the morning, through a forest known for illegal activity, with nothing to help him survive or see in the dark. I checked the mirrors as we drove on, half expecting to see him turn or follow, or do anything at all. He just faded back into the darkness behind us. As we got closer to the paved road, the tension slowly drained away. The familiar feel of asphalt under the tires felt like crossing a border back into a safer world. We stopped briefly, unloaded the rifles, and locked them in the trunk. The routine actions helped settle my nerves. Everything was normal again, at least on the surface. The drive home was quiet. My mind kept replaying the image of those white legs crossing the trail, the way they moved without hesitation through thick brush, and the blank indifference of the man on the road. I thought about why someone would be out there like that. Poachers, grow operations, people who do not want to be found, people who mark their territory by being strange enough to scare others away. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that we had wandered close to something we were not meant to see. Not something supernatural, just human activity hidden deep in a place where most people never go. The kind of thing that depends on isolation and fear to stay hidden. We made it home without incident. The night ended like any other, with gear put away and exhaustion settling in. But that forest no longer feels empty to me. I know now that even when you feel prepared, even when you're armed and confident, you can still cross paths with people who do not belong to any normal explanation. I will go back to Ocala National Forest. I love that place too much not to, but I will never forget that night, and I will never walk those trails again without remembering how easy it is to stumble into someone else's hidden world. Out there, the danger is not monsters or ghosts. It is people doing things they do not want anyone else to see, moving fast through the dark, and leaving you to wonder how close you really came to something worse. I went in alone on purpose. That trip was meant to be quiet, slow, and away from people. I had hiked a lot of Arizona before, but this part of the Mogollon Rim felt different the moment I climbed up into it. The air was cooler and heavy with moisture. The ground stayed soft under my boots even after days without rain. Ferns brushed my legs. Wild strawberries grew low and red in patches. Thorny bushes grabbed at my pack straps. Everything smelled green and wet, like the forest farther north, not the dry brown Arizona most people picture. I was high up around 7,500 feet, and the land rolled instead of breaking into cliffs like the desert below. The trees grew close together, tall and dark, with branches tangled overhead. The canopy was so thick it felt like walking inside a building with a low ceiling. My satellite communicator struggled to send even short check in messages. I had to stand in tiny openings and hold it up like an offering just to get a weak signal out at night. I did not see another person the entire time. Not a footprint, not a cut branch that looked fresh, not a cigarette, but I did find old signs of illegal pot grows, but they were clearly abandoned. Rotten irrigation hose, plastic sheeting torn and gray with age, rusted food cans half buried in dirt. It still made my skin crawl. I stayed alert and kept moving. By the end of the day, I found a place to camp that felt safe enough. It was a bench of ground above a creek, a wide ledge carved out long ago by water. It was almost flat, just big enough for my small tent and my pack. Behind me was a brush-covered slope that rose sharply. It was thick with thorny plants and loose rock, the kind of ground that forces noise out of you no matter how careful you are. In front of me, the bench ended in a sharp drop straight down to the creek. Floods had undercut it, leaving a hollow edge. Nothing was coming up from that direction without climbing straight up a dirt wall. The only way in, or out was a narrow game trail that cut through the brush from above. It was steep and loose. Any person or animal using it would have to knock rocks free and snap branches. I felt boxed in, but also protected. Once I was set up, nothing could surprise me without announcing itself. That night was one of the quietest I have ever experienced. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet, the kind that presses on you. The creek below did not rush or roar. It barely whispered. There was no wind in the trees, no birds calling as the light faded, no frogs, no insects, no background noise at all. When I stopped moving, the loudest thing was the blood pulsing in my ears. I could hear my own breathing too clearly. It was overcast and the moon was new, so there was no light. When I turned off my headlamp, the darkness felt solid. I could not see my hand in front of my face. The trees blended into one black mass. I lay there listening and waiting for my body to relax, but it never really did. Sometime in the middle of the night, my tent filled with light. It was sudden and bright, a clean white light that lit the fabric evenly, not flickering at first. It was strong enough that I could see the outline of my gear through the tent walls. For a split second, my brain tried to tell me it was morning, but it was wrong in a way that made my stomach drop. Morning light does not appear like that. This was sharp and focused like a spotlight. I did not think about animals. I thought about people. I thought about someone standing on the trail above me, shining a light down into my camp. I thought about how remote I was, and how long it would take for help to reach me if something went wrong. My body reacted before my mind finished its panic. I grabbed my flashlight and scrambled out of the tent, half tangled in the zipper. The moment I emerged, the light was gone. The darkness slammed back into place so fast it felt like a door closing. I stood there breathing hard, listening. Nothing moved. No footsteps retreating. No brush shaking. No rock sliding. Just that faint trickle of water far below. I swept my flashlight around in slow arcs. The beam cut through ferns and branches, caught on tree trunks, bounced off wet leaves. There was nowhere for a person to hide without me hearing them move. The slope behind me was silent and still. The trail above was empty. The drop in front of me was just black space. I turned the light off and listened harder, straining to catch any sound at all. There was nothing. After a minute or two, when my breathing slowed, I saw something through the trees. It was faint, far away, and easy to miss. A soft, white glow flickered between branches, low to the ground, then higher, then gone. It did not move like a flashlight beam. It did not swing or bounce. It was more like light leaking through fog, even though there was no fog. If the night had been even slightly brighter, I might have dismissed it as moonlight filtering through clouds. It stayed for less than a minute and then faded completely. I waited for sound to follow it. Nothing did. No steps, no voices, no mechanical hum. The forest stayed frozen and mute. I stood there with my light off, letting my eyes adjust, but the glow did not return. I did not sleep after that. I sat on my pack with my back against the slope and watched the darkness until my legs cramped and my neck ached. The silence never broke. Not once. The hours dragged by in slow pieces. I checked the trail again and again. Nothing changed. When dawn finally came, it felt wrong. The sky lightened to gray, then pale blue, but the forest did not wake up. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. The creek sounded the same as it had all night. I packed up carefully and searched the ground. There were no footprints, no crushed plants, no disturbed soil. The narrow trail looked exactly as it had the evening before. As I hiked out later that day, I kept thinking about the light. I replayed it over and over, trying to force it into something ordinary. That afternoon, the clouds thickened again, and far off to the west, I could see rain curtains hanging beneath a dark sky. By evening, when I reached a spot with better reception, I checked the weather reports and radar. There had been a storm moving through the region overnight, miles away, hidden beyond the folds of the rim. High elevation storms can throw light a long way. Sheet lightning can flash bright without thunder, especially when clouds and terrain block the sound. In a forest that dense and wet, sound dies fast. Light does not. The more I thought about it, the more it fit. A distant lightning discharge reflected and scattered by low clouds, lighting my tent like a giant camera flash. The faint glow afterward could have been another strike seen through layers of trees and mist, softened by distance. No sound because it was too far away. No movement because nothing had been there at all. It was a clean answer, and it made sense on paper. Still, that bench stays with me. The way the forest held its breath. The way the light came and went without warning. The way the dawn stayed silent. Even knowing what most likely caused it, I do not plan to camp there again. Some places feel wrong not because of what happens, but because of what is not. I used to spend a lot of time in El Dorado National Forest. I grew up around trees, dirt roads, and creeks, so the woods always felt normal to me. Quiet did not scare me. Being alone did not scare me. I had camped in storms, snow, heat, and places far more remote than most people ever see. That forest felt familiar, especially the spot along Sopiago Springs where my friends and I had camped more times than I could count. We knew the bends in the stream, the flat places for tents where the ground stayed dry, and where the crawdads liked to hide under rocks. It felt like our place. That weekend was supposed to be simple. A 3-day foraging camp, nothing serious. We wanted to practice living light, relying on what we could find. We brought MREs as backup, a few guns for hunting and protection, some basic shelter gear, and that was it. No fancy stuff. No plan beyond eating, hanging out, and enjoying being away from everything. The first night went exactly how it always had. We set up near the stream, built a decent fire, and got to work. Crawdads came easy, scooped up from under rocks with cold hands numb from the water. One of my buddies dropped a squirrel clean, and we cooked it slow over the fire. The air smelled like wet dirt, smoke, and pine. We drank a few beers, laughed, and let the dark settle in. The forest felt alive in the normal way. Bugs buzzing, water moving, distant sounds that blend together. We slept fine, spread out around the fire, weapons within reach but not clutched in fear. The next morning I woke up with a feeling I could not explain. Nothing was wrong on the surface. The weather was good. No tracks near camp. No signs of animals getting too close in the night. But something fell off in a way that sat heavy in my chest. The forest was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet. No birds. No squirrels. No small sounds that usually fill the gaps. It reminded me of other times in that same area when things had felt wrong, moments I had brushed off back then because nothing bad happened. This felt like that, but stronger. I tried to ignore it. We spent the day foraging, moving along the stream and into the trees. I kept scanning without thinking about it, checking shadows and gaps between trunks. I knew how predators move. I had seen bears, mountain lions, and coyotes before. This did not feel like any of that. It felt deliberate, like something was aware of us and choosing to stay just out of sight. I did not say anything. I did not want to be the guy ruining the trip with nerves. As the sun dropped, the feeling did not fade. It got worse. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. The trees felt closer together. The air felt heavy, like it does before a storm that never comes. When night fell, 2 of my friends decided to walk about 200 yards up the stream to take care of some things. That left me alone in camp. I did not like it, but I stayed behind to tend the fire. Once they disappeared into the dark, the feeling slammed into me hard. The silence deepened. The fire suddenly felt too small. I stacked more wood and built it up until it was throwing real light. The flames cracked and popped, sending sparks up into the trees. I grabbed my rifle and kept it close, resting it across my knees while I stared into the black beyond the firelight. That was when I started hearing it. Low sounds drifting through the woods behind me, opposite the direction my friends went. They were faint, almost like voices, but not clear enough to understand. Just enough to make the hair on my neck stand up. They came and went, never getting closer, never moving away. Just there. The only flashlights were gone with my friends, and that made the darkness feel thicker, like something solid pressing in. I kept scanning the tree-line, forcing myself to breathe slow. Then I saw movement, about 50 yards out, between the trees, Something shifted where the firelight barely reached. I raised a rifle and got the scope on it. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding hard enough to feel in my throat. The shape was wrong. It looked human in outline, but it was low to the ground, moving on all fours. The arms were too long, bending in a way that did not look natural. The back was hunched, the head low. It reminded me of an ape, but thinner, stretched out, and moving with purpose. It froze for a split second, just long enough for my brain to register what I was seeing, and then it moved fast, loping deeper into the woods with a smooth, powerful motion that did not sound heavy at all. I lost sight of it almost immediately. After that, the sound started again. Leaves shifting, light steps, twigs snapping, always circling, never crossing into the firelight. Always on the side of camp opposite where my friends had gone. It felt like whatever was knew exactly where everyone was. I kept the fire roaring and stayed locked on the dark, turning slowly, trying to cover every angle. I did not see it again, but I never felt alone for a second. Time stretched. Every minute felt like 10. When my friends finally came back, they found me crouched by the fire, rifle up, sweeping the trees through the scope. I was shaking, not from cold but from adrenaline. I told them what I saw. Their faces changed in a way that told me everything before they even explained themselves. They had heard the same low sound where they were, the same feeling of being watched. That was why they came back early. We did not joke after that. We did not downplay it. We built the fire as big as we could and set up 3 people watching at all times. Guns loaded, eyes burning from staring into the dark. The forest stayed dead, quiet except for those occasional sounds just beyond the light. No animal calls, no wind, nothing that made sense. Nobody slept that night. Hours crawled by. Every sound felt like the start of something worse. Whatever was out there never showed itself again, but it never left either. The feeling of being watched stayed constant, pressing on us until dawn finally started to gray the sky. As soon as there was enough light to see, we broke camp fast. No breakfast, no packing neatly, just stuffing gear, stamping out the fire, and getting out. The forest felt normal again as we hiked out, but that did not make it better. It made it worse. Like whatever had been there simply chose not to follow. We never camped at Sopiago Springs again. We still go into the woods, still camp, still hunt and forage. But we avoid that place without talking about it. I think about that night more than I want to admit. I replay the shape I saw, the way it moved, the way the forest went silent around us. I do not know what it was, and I do not need a name for it. I know how animals act. I know how people act. The thing did not fit cleanly into either. Some places feel wild in a good way. Others feel like you were tolerated for a short time and nothing more. That spot along the stream taught me the difference. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, enough to know the difference between normal night sounds and the kind that make your body go cold before your mind catches up. That night stands out because everything else about the trip felt calm and normal. It was the summer of 2019, warm days and cool nights, the kind that makes sleeping outside easy. We were in the Adirondack Mountains near Warrensburg, tucked into a campground surrounded by tall trees and thick brush. My girlfriend's parents had bought the camp of the year before, and it still smelled new inside, clean and sealed like something that was supposed to keep you safe from whatever was outside. The campsite was laid out in a loose loop. A few other campers were scattered around, mostly older couples in RVs, and a couple of tents not far from us. 2 tents belonging to my girlfriend's family were set up about 10 feet from the camper, staked into the gravel and dirt. The ground around everything was a mix of crushed stone, pine needles, and patches of hard dirt. During the day, it felt open and friendly. At night, it felt like the trees leaned in closer. Inside the camper, the lights were off. Her parents were asleep in the main bed, and her younger sister was on the top bunk above me. I was on the bottom bunk, close to the sidewall. My girlfriend was next to me, half asleep. The small window by my bunk was tilted open just enough to let some air in. It had dark tinting, the kind that makes the outside look like a black mirror at night. I was on my phone, scrolling without thinking, letting my eyes get tired before putting it down. The glow from a screen felt bright in the darkness, and I remember thinking I should shut it off soon. That was when I heard the gravel. At first it was light, almost easy to miss. A soft shifting sound like someone adjusting their weight. Then it became clear. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Each step slow and deliberate. The sound came from the direction of the fire pit and moved along the side of the camper. Gravel sounds different than dirt or leaves. It is sharp and clear, and there is no mistaking it when weight presses down on it. What made my stomach drop was the rhythm. It wasn't scattered or fast like an animal. It wasn't dragging or uneven. It was steady, 2 clear steps at a time. Left, right, left, right. Only 2 feet. Whatever it was, it walked like a person. I froze with my phone still in my hand. The steps got closer, each crunch louder than the last. The sound traveled along the length of the camper, staying close, like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. My breathing slowed without me trying. I became very aware of how loud even small movements felt inside the camper. The footsteps stopped right next to my window. The silence after that was worse than the sound. I stared at the dark glass inches from my face. I couldn't see anything outside. The tint reflected the inside darkness back at me. But I knew that if someone was standing there, they were close enough to hear me breathe. I thought about the light from my phone and how it must have looked from outside, a soft glow in the middle of the woods. I shut the phone off and slid it under the blanket. I didn't move after that. My body felt tight, like every muscle was braced. I waited for something else to happen, a knock, a voice, anything. Nothing came. Seconds stretched out, then minutes. The air coming through the tilted window felt colder. Eventually, the footsteps started again. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. They moved away from the camper, slow and steady, heading toward the tents. I didn't move until the sound faded into the distance. When I finally reached for my phone again, I kept the brightness as low as it would go. I sent a message to my girlfriend, explaining what I had heard and how close it was. She was awake enough to read it right away, and she had heard it too. That confirmation made it worse in a way, because it meant it wasn't just my imagination filling in gaps. We lay there in the dark, listening. A few minutes passed, and then we heard it again, this time coming from the tents. Fabric shifted. A zipper moved. Not fast, not frantic, but careful, like someone trying not to make noise. The sound of hands going through bags followed. Soft rustling mixed with the dull thud of items being moved around. My heart was pounding so hard, I felt it in my throat. The tents were close enough that the sound were clear, close enough that whoever was there could have reached the camper in seconds if they wanted to. I thought about the younger sister sleeping above me, about her parents just a few feet away, completely unaware. My girlfriend moved quietly and woke her parents. There were no raised voices, no panic, just a quick explanation of what we had heard and why it didn't feel right. We all waited inside for what felt like a long time, listening for any sign that whoever was outside was still there. The sounds eventually stopped. The woods went back to their normal night noise. Crickets, a distant owl, the wind moving through branches. It felt fake, like a switch had been flipped. After about 10 minutes, her parents decided to go outside and check. I stayed inside, sitting up in the bunk, listening to the camper door open and close. I expected to hear something then, footsteps running away, branches snapping, anything. There was nothing. The quiet felt heavy. They walked around with flashlights, checking the area around the camper and the tents. No one was there. No movement. No shapes slipping between trees. When they came back inside, everything was calm on the surface. The woods had swallowed whatever had been out there. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every sound felt sharp again. I replayed the footsteps over and over in my head, the way they had stopped right at my window. I kept thinking about how close that person had been, how thin the wall between us really was. Morning light changed the campground completely. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and birds moved around like nothing had ever happened. When we checked the tents, it was obvious they had been opened. Zippers were not in the same place they had been left. Some bags had been shifted around. Nothing major was missing, but it was clear someone had gone through them. The neighboring camper, an older couple, mentioned that they had heard something during the night too. Footsteps. Movement. They hadn't gone outside, just stayed quiet and waited it out. Hearing that made everything feel more real. It wasn't just us. There were no signs left behind that meant anything. No clear footprints in the gravel that could be followed. No broken locks. No damage. Whoever it was knew how to move quietly and leave without a trace. Maybe they were looking for easy things to steal. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were watching. The truth is, there are a lot of reasons someone might move through a campground at night, and none of them are comforting when you're asleep nearby. The rest of the trip passed without incident, but the feeling never fully left. Every night after that, I checked the window before lying down. I kept my phone face down and dark. I listened longer than I should have. That was the last time we camped in that area. The next year, when summer came around again, her family chose a different place. No one said it outright, but we all knew why. The Adirondacks are huge, and most of the time they are peaceful, even beautiful. But that night reminded me that the woods don't care about comfort or plans. People move through them for reasons you may never understand, and sometimes they come close enough to remind you how exposed you really are. Nothing followed us home. There were no strange endings or unanswered questions that kept growing. What happened stayed in that place, tied to that campground and that night. It was a person walking on 2 feet, close enough to hear breathing through a tilted window, close enough to unzip tents and leave without being seen. Knowing that is what still sticks with me. It wasn't something unreal or impossible. It was real, and it happened, and the only reason it didn't go further is because whoever was chose to move on. One time at band camp was a joke we all said back then, but this had nothing to do with that kind of memory. This was during my time in Boy Scouts in Wisconsin, when I was still young enough to believe that being outdoors always meant safety as long as you followed the rules. Wisconsin had a lot of land that feels old in a way that is hard to explain. Trees grow thick and tall, and the ground feels heavy, like it remembers things. One of the places we camped was called Imar, Indian Mound Reservation. At the time, I knew the name, but I did not really understand what it meant. I just knew it was a big wooded area with trails, open fields, and strange rounded hills that sat low to the ground. Those hills were burial mounds. They were not marked with signs or fences. They were just there, rising gently from the forest floor, covered in grass and leaves. If you did not know what you were looking at, you might think they were small dirt piles left over from construction or erosion. Some looked like the berms you see at a gun range. Back then, we walked past them without much thought. We were told to respect the area, stay on trails, and not dig or climb on anything that looked unnatural. I followed those rules, but I did not feel any fear during the day. The camp was set up in a clearing surrounded by trees that dropped their leaves early in the fall. The air was cool, not cold yet, but damp enough that everything smelled like wet earth. Leaves stuck to boots and pant legs. When you walked, the sound was not sharp or crunchy. It was soft and dragging, like paper being pulled slowly across the ground. At night, that sound carried farther than you would expect. My tent was a basic 2-person tent, nothing special. Thin fabric, a zipper that always caught near the bottom, and a floor that felt like nothing between you and the ground. I laid out my sleeping bag and tried to sleep early because the days were long and full of hiking. I remember feeling tired, but not fully relaxed. The forest does that. Even when you are exhausted, your body stays alert. Sometime in the night, I woke up without knowing why. There was no dream that pulled me out of sleep. My eyes just opened, and I lay there staring at the dark fabric above my face. The forest was quiet in the way that makes your ears strain for sound. Then I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was someone walking to the bathroom area. That happens sometimes. But these steps were slow and steady. 2 steps, a slight pause, then 2 more. What stood out was the sound. It was not boots crunching on dry leaves. It was a dragging sound like someone was pulling their feet instead of lifting them. The leaves were damp from earlier in the evening, and the sound was soft but very clear. The footsteps moved around my tent in a circle. I could track them without moving anything but my eyes. My head stayed still, pressed into the sleeping bag. The steps came closer to the side, then farther away, then closer again. When they reached the front of the tent, right where the zipper was, they stopped. There was a pause that felt longer than it probably was. My breathing slowed on its own, like my body was trying to disappear. After the pause, the footsteps turned and went the other direction, circling the tent again. The same dragging sound. No stumbling. No hurry. Just steady movement. I waited for a cough, a sniff, the sound of fabric, anything that would make a human. Nothing came. No flashlight beam hit the tent. No shadow passed over the fabric. This happened more than once. The steps circled, stopped at the door, paused, then moved away. I never heard the sound of someone stepping away into the distance. It was like they were only interested in the space right around my tent. I did not hear branches snapping or twigs breaking beyond that circle. Fear is a strange thing when you are young. It does not always come with panic. Sometimes it is quiet and heavy. I did not think of ghosts or monsters. What I felt was the sense that something was wrong, that I was not alone in a way that did not make sense. It did not feel like another scout messing around. It did not feel like an adult checking on us. It felt like being watched without eyes. I stayed still the entire time. I did not unzip the tent. I did not call out. I just listened until the footsteps finally stopped. When they did, the silence felt louder than the sound had been. I lay there for a long time after that, staring at the darkness, afraid that moving would bring the sound back. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it was shallow sleep. When morning came, everything looked normal. No footprint stood out because the ground was covered in leaves. No one mentioned anything strange. I did not say anything either. I convinced myself that it had been someone walking nearby, maybe lost, maybe checking something. During the day, the burial mounds looked harmless again, just gentle rises in the land. The second night, I prepared myself to stay awake. I went to sleep with tension already in my shoulders. I woke up several times, listening hard. Nothing happened. No footsteps. No movement. Just the normal sounds of the forest settling, branches shifting, distant animals moving through the undergrowth. Still, I did not relax. I slept light until morning. Years later, I understand why that first night stayed with me. Wisconsin forests are home to many animals that move in ways we do not expect. Deer can walk softly and circle areas out of curiosity. A person could have been moving quietly, lost, or checking camps, trying not to be seen. The dragging sound could have been heavy boots or someone tired and shuffling. The pause at the tent door could have been someone realizing they were too close and deciding to leave. What makes it scary is not what it was, but what it could have been. Someone watching kids sleep without making a sound. Someone testing how close they could get without being noticed. An animal curious enough to circle, but smart enough not to touch. The land itself, shaped by human history and death, amplifying every sound and thought. When I think back on it now, the fear does not come from spirits or the supernatural. It comes from how vulnerable I was, lying in a thin tent in the dark, unable to see what was just a few feet away. It comes from knowing that the world does not announce itself when something is wrong. Sometimes it just walks quietly around you, pauses, and leaves you alone with your thoughts. The camp ended without incident. We packed up, hiked out, and moved on other trips. But Imar stayed with me. Even now, when I walk through forests in the fall and hear leaves drag instead of crunch, my body remembers that night. I remember the sound of slow footsteps, the pause at the door, and the choice I made to stay silent. Whatever was there moved on. I stayed where I was. And that was the end of it. It happened on a late summer night at a small campground that didn't get much traffic. We were there with a few friends, spread across two tents, close enough to hear each other move around, but far enough that the darkness swallowed everything once the fire died. The trees were thick, the paths were narrow, and there were no lights except the moon, which that night might as well not have existed. I remember the air being heavy and still, the kind that makes every smell hang around longer than it should. Smoke from the fire, damp dirt, pine needles, and the sour edge of beer all mixed together. Around 10 at night, My stomach started turning on me. It was one of those sudden, urgent feelings where your body makes the decision before your brain catches up. I knew I wasn't going to be able to wait until morning. The restrooms were about a quarter-mile away, down the main path, past a few empty sites that hadn't been used in years. I announced I was heading out, grabbed a small flashlight that barely worked, and started walking. The darkness felt thicker once I left our site. The fire glow disappeared fast, and the trees closed in. The path was packed dirt with loose gravel, and it made a soft crunch under my boots that sounded louder than it should have. Every sound carried: bugs buzzing, something small moving in the brush, my own breathing. I kept the flashlight off most of the time to save the battery, using it only when the path dipped or split. About halfway there, I saw someone step out onto the main path ahead of me. They came from a side trail that led to an unused site. That site was far enough away that you had to mean to go there. It wasn't on the way to anything. The person moved in a way I recognized right away. My friend had a strange walk, a slight hitch in one leg, like he favored it without realizing. I had seen that walk 1,000 times. Even in the dark, the rhythm of it was unmistakable. I wasn't surprised at first. I figured he had gone for a walk or needed the bathroom too. The distance between us stayed about the same, maybe 40 feet. Every now and then, he turned his head and body slightly, like he was checking behind him. I remember feeling annoyed more than scared. The whole thing felt like he was trying to mess with me. I kept walking, my focus more on getting to the restroom than anything else. As we moved farther down the path, he sped up, not running, just walking faster, enough that I had to pick up my pace to keep him in sight. The darkness swallowed him in pieces. First his legs, then his torso, then his head, until he was just a moving shadow. At a bend in the path, he disappeared completely. I stood there for a moment, listening, expecting to hear footsteps or a laugh. Nothing, just the woods. I finished the walk alone, used the restroom, and started back. On the way back, I kept expecting to see him step out again or come up behind me. It didn't happen. When I got back to our site, he was there, sitting like he hadn't moved all night. Everyone acted normal. When I brought it up, it turned into a joke. According to them, he had never left. I chalked it up to them messing with me and let it go. At the time, it felt harmless, just a little weird. A few hours later, around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. The fire was long dead, and the campsite was quiet except for snoring and the occasional snap of wood shifting. I didn't feel like making the long walk again, so I stepped away from the tents and into the trees. The ground was cold under my boots, and the night felt sharper, clearer than before. The alcohol buzz was mostly gone. My head felt steady. When I finished and turned back toward the tents, I heard the sound of a zipper. It was slow and careful, the unmistakable sound of a tent being opened. I froze for a second, listening. In the dark, I could make out a shape moving near where my friend's tent was set up. The zipper closed again. The sound was clear enough that there was no doubt about what it was. As I walked closer, the shape moved a few steps away from the tent. I could see the outline of a person now, the same height and build as my friend. He reached into his pocket, and the sharp click of a lighter broke the silence. The brief flashes lit up his face in pieces. His nose, his cheek, the shape of his eyes. When the flame caught, it was clear. It was him. He lit a cigarette, took a drag, and stood there like he was waiting for something. I felt that same irritation from earlier, mixed now with confusion. This felt like another attempt to mess with me. He said something, and I answered, wondering why he was being so loud in the middle of the night. He repeated himself, louder this time, like he was trying to prove a point. His tone wasn't joking. It was flat, almost mechanical. Then he shook his head slowly, like I had missed something obvious, and turned away. He walked toward the parked cars at the edge of the site. I followed, keeping my eyes on him. The distance between us stayed small, maybe 30 feet. He passed behind one of the cars, and when I rounded the corner after him, he was gone. There was nowhere he could have gone that fast. The area was open. No trails, no cover, no sound of footsteps. I stood there, heart pounding, scanning the darkness. I felt anger more than fear at first. I was convinced he was hiding, waiting to jump out or laugh. I walked straight to his tent and shined my light on it. It It was zipped up tight. I could hear him inside, breathing slow and steady, the sound of deep sleep. I stood there longer than I want to admit, listening, trying to make sense of it. There was no way he could have beaten me back and zipped himself in without making noise. There was no second tent he could have ducked into. Everyone else was asleep. I didn't sleep much after that. My mind kept replaying the way he walked, the way the lighter flared, the sound of his voice. It all felt too specific to be a trick. In the morning, I checked the area by the cars. There were footprints in the dirt, but the ground was too disturbed to tell whose they were. I walked down the path toward the unused site from earlier and found fresh tire tracks and signs that someone had set up late and left early. A ranger later mentioned that another camper had come in after dark, used one of the old sites, and packed up before sunrise. He described the guy without knowing why I was asking. Same height, same limp, heavy smoker. That explanation should have been enough, and on paper it was. Two strangers in the dark, alcohol, exhaustion, and a brain eager to fill in gaps. But what stuck with me was how close it felt, how certain I was, how real it all looked and sounded. I didn't see something impossible that night. I saw something ordinary in the worst conditions, and my mind connected it to someone I trusted. What scared me wasn't the idea of something unreal. It was how easily my brain convinced me I was seeing my friend, how quickly certainty replaced doubt. Since then, I pay more attention to darkness, to how much it hides, and how little it takes for your mind to lie to you without meaning to. That night ended with no answers that felt clean, just a quiet understanding that being sure doesn't always mean being right. I had been driving for hours already, the kind of slow back road, driving where you stop thinking in words and just follow the bends of the road. It was late afternoon turning into early evening, that gray time where the light goes flat and everything looks a little farther away than it really is. I wasn't in a hurry. The plan was simple. Find a quiet spot, set up camp before dark, cook something basic, and sleep hard. I had my dog with me, same as always. She had done this with me plenty of times before and usually treated it like a routine job. Ride in the car, sniff around, circle the site, then curl up like nothing in the world could bother her. That was not how it went. I had turned off the main forest road and started crawling along a rougher track, the kind with weeds growing up the middle and stones clicking under the tires. The trees were thicker here and the hill climbed fast. My engine worked harder and the sound bounced back at me from the slope. I slowed down and started scanning for a place to pull off. I wasn't being picky. I just needed something flat enough to park and pitch my tent. Almost as soon as I stopped the car, my dog's whole body changed. Her ears went stiff and her back hair lifted like someone had dragged a hand the wrong way down her spine. She let out this low sound, not a bark, not a growl, just a steady vibration in her chest. She stayed pressed close to my leg instead of wandering off like she usually did. I told myself it was probably wildlife. Deer, maybe a bear farther off. She had smelled things before and gotten alert, but this was different. She did not settle. She did not sniff around. She stayed locked in, staring into the trees like she was waiting for something to step out. I walked a few steps away from the car, and she followed, so close I could feel her shoulder brushing my calf. Her head kept turning, tracking something I couldn't see. That was when I first heard the voices. At first, I thought it was wind, the way sound can roll up a hill and break apart. Then it came again, more clearly. Male voices, more than one. Not shouting, not whispering, just talking. The strange thing was I could not pick out a single word. It was like hearing speech through water. I stopped walking and held still. The voices seemed close, like just beyond the trees, but when I tried to fix their location, it slipped away from me. They weren't coming from one clear direction. They were just there. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to make sense of it. The hill was steep, and I figured maybe the sound was traveling up from a road or a campsite below. Sound does weird things in the woods, especially with slopes. I knew that. I had experienced that before. Still, my chest felt tight. My dog's low sound never stopped. Her eyes stayed wide, and her body stayed tense like a coiled spring. I tried another pull off farther up the hill. Same thing. The moment the engine cut, her hackles went up again. She paced in a tight circle, nails clicking on rock, then froze and stared. The voices came back, fading in and out. Every time they returned, they sounded close enough that I expected to see someone step into view. But the trees stayed still. No footsteps, no breaking branches, just that shapeless sound of men talking without words. I kept telling myself it was fine. Hunters maybe, or other campers. But something fell off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Not watched in a dramatic way, just noticed. Like I had entered someone else's space without realizing it. My skin prickled, and I caught myself listening harder than I ever had before, trying to catch any detail that would explain it. Nothing came together. Time stretched. I checked my watch at one point and realized my dog had been like this for almost 45 minutes. She had not relaxed once. No sniffing, no wandering, no sitting down. She stayed wound tight, eyes fixed on the woods, that low sound still humming in her chest. She trusted these trips. She trusted me. For her to be this unsettled meant something was very wrong, even if I couldn't see it. The light was dropping fast now. Shadows filled in the gaps between trees, and the hill blocked what was left of the sky. The forest felt heavier, like it was closing in. The voices came again, closer than before. Still no words, just the shape of speech. I realized my breathing had gone shallow, and my shoulders were up around my ears. I was trying to convince myself to stay, because leaving felt like admitting fear, and I hate doing that. But another part of me, the quiet part one usually ignore, was telling me to go. I got back in the car without any dramatic moment. I didn't run. I didn't slam doors. I just opened the door, let my dog jump in, and sat behind the wheel. Even with the doors closed, I could still hear the voices faintly, like they were right outside the car, but somehow not touching it. My dog stood on the seat instead of lying down, staring out the window, muscles tight. I started the engine and pulled back onto the track. As I drove away, the voices faded, then came back again, then faded for good. My dog finally sat down, then slowly lay down, but she did not sleep. She watched the road behind us in the rear window for a long time. I did not stop again that night. I drove until the forest thinned and the road smoothed out. I found a lit gas station, parked under the lights, and just sat there for a while with the engine off. My hands were shaking then, the delayed reaction finally catching up. I replayed everything in my head, trying to pin it down to something normal. Other campers talking out of sight, sound bouncing up the hill, my dog reacting to wildlife. All reasonable, all possible, but none of that explained the way the voices felt so close without ever becoming clear. None of it explained my dog's behavior lasting that long without easing. And none of it explained the deep sense of wrongness that settled into me and refused to move until I was miles away. I didn't camp that night. I slept in my car near town, doors locked, dog pressed against my side like she was making sure I stayed put. The next morning, in daylight, everything seemed less sharp, less threatening. I almost laughed at myself. Almost. But I didn't go back. I didn't tell myself I should have pushed through. I didn't try to prove anything. I had trusted my intuition, and it had gotten me out of there without anything happening. That was the clear ending, the only one that mattered. Whatever those voices were, whoever was out there on that hill, I never found out. And I'm fine with that. I had been a park ranger for nearly 6 years, and I thought I had seen most of what the forest could throw at me. Early mornings, late nights, routine patrols. It all blurred together into a rhythm I had grown comfortable with. But one summer night changed that sense of familiarity forever. It was late August, the kind of summer that clings to the land with heat and humidity, but the nights are sharp and cold, slicing through the air like a knife. I was on a routine night patrol, driving slowly along the gravel roads that wound through the back reaches of the park. The moon was just a sliver, barely lighting the way, and the headlights of my truck barely pierced the dense black of the forest. The radio crackled faintly with the distant chatter of other rangers, mostly routine reports about closed trails or lost hikers who had been found hours before. The forest that night seemed alive in a way, I had never felt before. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs was muted, and even the rustling of leaves sounded different, sharper, almost too deliberate. I pulled over near an old logging road I was supposed to inspect, parked, and got out. The gravel crunched under my boots, and the smell of damp earth and pine filled the air. I had a flashlight, a map, and my usual ranger tools, but no matter how many times I had walked this section of forest, the dark had a way of swallowing everything familiar. I started walking down the road, methodically checking the trail markers, the old logging stumps, and the water markers that were often overlooked. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. On the ground, just past an old bridge that hadn't been used in years, there were deep, uneven tracks. At first, I thought it was a vehicle, a 4x4 perhaps, but the spacing was wrong. Too irregular, almost like something had been running on four legs, then stopping, then running again. I crouched down to examine the prints more closely. They were large, much larger than any deer or bear prints I had ever seen, and the depth suggested something heavy had pressed into the soft mud. My first instinct was to radio back to base, but my radio was dead, completely dead, as if it had lost all signal at once. I double-checked the battery. It was fine. Nothing. Unease settled in, a weight pressing on my chest. I shined my flashlight along the road, expecting perhaps a hiker or a lost camper, but the beam only revealed more darkness. The trees on either side of the road seemed impossibly dense, their branches intertwining overhead to form a roof of shadow. I walked a few more steps, and then I saw it. A tree, freshly snapped near the base, leaned across the road like a barricade. The break wasn't old. The wood was pale, raw, splintered. Whoever, or whatever, had done this had done it recently. I could feel the hairs on my neck standing on end. I circled the fallen tree, scanning the surroundings, listening to the forest, straining for any sound. My flashlight caught movement, a flicker of something at the edge of the trees. I froze. My mind tried to reason it. A deer, a raccoon, a stray dog. But instinct screamed otherwise. The movement was deliberate, purposeful, almost predatory. I moved slowly back toward my truck, trying not to make any noise. That's when I heard it, a low thud like heavy boots or claws hitting the forest floor behind me. My heart jumped. I didn't run immediately. I knew the forest better than that, and panic can be fatal in the woods. I took slow, measured steps toward the truck, keeping my flashlight trained behind me. Another thud, then another. The sound wasn't steady. It was erratic, like something was keeping pace, but choosing when to move. By the time I reached my truck, the air felt tight, thick with tension. I jumped in, slammed the doors, locked them, and started the engine. My flashlight was still in my hand, shining across the road. I started to drive slowly, keeping my eyes on the dark edges of the forest, trying to catch a glimpse of what was following. Nothing appeared at first, but then a shadow moved just outside the reach of the headlights, and I felt a sharp jolt of fear. Whatever it was enormous. The rest of the night was a blur of careful driving, short stops to make sure nothing was near the truck, and constant scanning of the forest edges. By dawn, I had made it back to the ranger station without incident, but I was drained. I reported the incident, describing the prints, the broken tree, and the strange sounds. A team went back to investigate later, but by the time they arrived, the tracks had vanished. There was no trace of any creature large enough to make those prints, no signs of human activity, nothing but the forest itself. I never saw that shadow again, but the feeling stayed with me. The forest is full of animals, but there are times when it feels alive in a way that doesn't make sense. That night taught me that even familiar places can hide things that are beyond understanding, and some parts of the wilderness aren't meant to be explored alone. I never walked that logging road at night again. I still patrol the park, still guide hikers and maintain the trails, but that section of the forest I avoided. There's a line in the woods, a limit to curiosity, and crossing it can bring you face to face with something you can't explain. Experience taught me to respect the forest, but that night taught me fear. Fear is real, measurable, and it lives in the dark spaces between trees, in the silence of a forest that suddenly feels too still. It's something no training can fully prepare you for, something you carry with you long after the sun rises and the danger seems gone. And I carry it with me still. Every time I walk the trails, every time I hear a sound that doesn't belong, every time I realize that some mysteries of the wilderness are better left alone. I remember the first night I really understood how unforgiving the forest could be. I had been a park ranger for about 4 years at that point, mostly doing patrols, maintaining trails, and checking campsites in a national forest in the northern part of the state. Most of the time it was quiet. Too quiet sometimes, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper aware of every sound. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. That night, I learned how quickly that quiet could turn into something threatening, and how small mistakes could become dangerous. It started as a routine evening patrol. The forest was dense, mostly pine and fir, with some areas thick with underbrush. I had parked my truck near the main trailhead and had my flashlight, radio, and standard ranger gear. I didn't usually patrol that far into the back trails at night, but there had been reports of people hiking after dark, which was illegal in that area. I wanted to check a few secluded campsites where people sometimes set up without permits. The sky was clear, and the moon had barely risen, so it was darker than I expected. I started on the main path, moving slowly, my flashlight casting long shadows between the trees. The smell of damp earth and pine was strong. I kept hearing small noises, branches snapping underfoot, the soft rustle of animals, but nothing unusual. After about an hour of walking, I reached a small clearing with an abandoned campsite. There were remnants of fire pit, old food wrappers, and a tattered tent half collapsed in the corner. Nothing dangerous, but enough to know someone had been there recently. I made a note on my patrol log and took a photo for records. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving through the underbrush. But the sound was heavier, deliberate, like someone or something was stepping carefully behind me. My heart rate spiked. I slowed down and turned my flashlight toward the noise, sweeping it across the trees and undergrowth. Nothing. I stayed still for a few moments, listening, my ears straining in the quiet forest. The sound stopped. I started walking again, but now I was tense, every step calculated. My radio crackled once, but there was no one on the other end. I kept moving toward the next trail junction. That's when I noticed something strange. My tracks were being followed. At first, I thought it was my imagination, shadows playing tricks under the weak moonlight. But then I saw the footprints. They weren't human in size, slightly larger than mine, but the stride and depth were too heavy for a deer. And they weren't consistent. Sometimes they'd appear right behind me. Other times I'd catch a glimpse from the corner of my eye, as if whoever or whatever was moving erratically. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself that I was trained for this, that the forest was my territory, that no one could sneak up on me that easily. I reached a denser section where the trees grew close together and visibility dropped. The noises came back, louder now. Heavy breathing, the snapping of branches closer and closer, almost matching my pace. My flashlight beam flicked over a shadow, a shape moving just beyond the reach of the light. Adrenaline surged. I gripped my radio and tried to call the station, but static filled the speaker. I couldn't pinpoint the source of the movement. Every time I paused, the noises stopped. Every time I moved, they moved. I knew the forest well, knew every twist of trail and ridge, but now it felt like it was hiding something from me, something dangerous. I realized I had to get out before it cornered me. I turned off the flashlight to avoid being seen and tried to move quietly toward the main trail, the one leading back to my truck. I crouched low, listening. The sound was coming from all directions now, rustling in the underbrush, moving in bursts. My heart was pounding. I told myself not to panic, to remember my training. I kept my eyes adjusted to the darkness, looking for any movement, any telltale sign. It was then I tripped. My foot caught on a root, and I fell hard, scraping my hands and knees. Pain shot through me, but worse was the sound it made. The noises around me went silent for a heartbeat, and then one heavy step landed very close. I froze. I could feel a presence near me, just beyond the edge of the trees. My instinct screamed at me to run. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and bolted toward the faint light of my truck in the distance. Branches lashed at my face and arms, but I kept moving, never looking back. I reached the truck, fumbling with the keys with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and I spun the truck around, tires digging into the dirt. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I drove off. For a split second, I thought I saw a large shadow standing at the edge of the tree line, just watching me leave. Back at the station, I filed my report and checked the area again in daylight. Nothing unusual remained. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there except the old campsite debris I'd found earlier. I never figured out what exactly had followed me that night. Could have been a hunter, lost and tracking me by accident, or a wild animal moving unusually. Whatever it was, it had been big, deliberate, and terrifyingly close. That night changed how I patrolled. I never underestimated the forest again. I always carried extra backup, made sure my radio was functional, and I avoided those back trails after dark. The forest was no longer just quiet and peaceful. It was alive, unpredictable, and sometimes it could be dangerous in ways that didn't make sense. I never told anyone exactly what happened, but I never forgot it. Every time I walk the forest at night now, I move a little slower, listen a little harder, and remember that the wilderness doesn't owe anyone safety. It only demands respect, and sometimes it reminds you why. I have been working as a park ranger for almost 6 years at a large, heavily forested national park in the northern part of the state. It was the kind of place where the trees seemed to swallow the sun before noon, where the wind carried a chill even in the middle of summer, and where silence had weight. You could feel it pressing against your ears, making every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. I had learned to respect the forest in every way, to read it like a book, and to never underestimate it. But nothing had prepared me for what I would encounter one late October evening. The day had been long. I had patrolled the North Ridge, checking the fire lines, inspecting a few campsites, and keeping an eye out for anyone breaking park rules. The sun had dipped low behind the horizon, and the forest began to darken faster than I had expected. I had my truck parked near an old logging road that wound through the trees, a dirt path lined with pine and spruce. It was a place few people ventured, especially at night, and for good reason. The road curved sharply, sloped downhill, and had several spots where a vehicle could easily get stuck. My shift was almost over, but the radio crackled with a report of a camper who hadn't checked in from a remote section near an old ranger cabin, about 4 miles deeper into the woods. I decided I would make a quick check, thinking it would be a routine call, a hiker who had lost cell service or wandered off the trail. The truck's headlights barely penetrated the darkness. The road narrowed, and I had to slow down to a crawl. On either side, the trees were dense, their branches scratching against each other as if whispering. Every once in a while, I would catch movement at the corner of my eye. Deer, I assumed, though sometimes it looked like something larger, heavier. The air smelled damp, and the wind had picked up, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves. It was quiet, too quiet except for the engine humming and the occasional rustle of leaves. I reached the fork where the cabin was supposed to be. The signpost was old, the paint faded, almost unreadable. I parked the truck and grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows in a narrow cone. The cabin should have been just a few hundred meters away, hidden behind a cluster of firs, but when I arrived, I froze. It was gone, not abandoned or falling apart. The building simply wasn't there. The clearing where it should have stood was empty, only the forest floor and scattered rocks visible. My heart began to thump faster, but I shook it off, thinking someone must have dismantled it. Maybe a group of campers had removed the structure years ago, and nobody had updated the maps. Still, it felt wrong. Too wrong. There was a silence in the air that pressed against me, heavy and unnatural. I started back toward the truck, scanning the undergrowth with my light. That's when I saw the tracks. Human footprints, barefoot, wet mud clinging to them. leading away from the clearing in a line that disappeared into the trees. The prints were fresh, no more than an hour old. Whoever had been here had come through recently. I followed them cautiously. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became, the branches closing in overhead until I had to duck and push through. I kept my hand near my belt where my radio and flashlight were clipped, prepared to call for backup if anything happened. Then I heard it, a faint, dragging sound like someone moving something heavy across the forest floor. I froze. The sound stopped when I stopped. I moved again, and it started again, closer this time. I could hear the faint snap of branches under weight that wasn't mine. My instinct screamed to turn around, but curiosity kept me moving forward. The trail led to a small clearing I hadn't noticed on any of the maps, barely large enough for a single vehicle. In the center lay a rusted old pickup truck, covered in moss and dirt. It had clearly been abandoned for years. But the odd thing, there were fresh scratches along the hood and deep marks on the roof like someone had dragged something across it recently. I was about to leave when I noticed a body, partially hidden under a tarp that had been soaked and caked with mud. A man lay face down. He was alive, barely. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half open, and his clothes were torn and wet. I radioed in immediately, giving my exact location and asking for an ambulance. I stayed with him, keeping him conscious, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. He whispered something incoherent, pointing toward the woods. I didn't ask. I just shined my light where he indicated. There was nothing, just trees, silence. When the medics arrived, I followed them back to my truck. The sun had long set, leaving the forest wrapped in black velvet. We carried the man out, carefully, and I stayed behind for a moment, looking at the empty clearing, the tracks leading into the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been following me the entire time. My stomach was tight, my pulse loud. Weeks later, I learned the man had been hiking alone and was attacked by another human, someone with a history of evading authorities, living in the forest for months. He had been beaten and left for dead, but had somehow managed to crawl to that clearing. The authorities never found the attacker. The forest kept its secrets. Since that night, I've driven that logging road hundreds of times, but I never take the shortcut again. I stick to the main trails. Every time I see a dark clearing or hear the snap of a branch when no one is there, I remember that night. The forest is alive in ways most people don't see, and while it may not be haunted, it has its own kind of terror. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it hides things you never want to find. I remember that summer like it was yesterday, though it's been years. I was working as a park ranger in a vast national forest in the Pacific Northwest. The forest was dense, old growth, full of cedar, fir, and spruce, with thick underbrush that swallowed the sunlight. The kind of place where you could walk for hours and hear nothing but the wind, the occasional bird, and the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. I had been on patrol all morning, walking along a rarely used trail that cut through a canyon. The trail narrow, rocky, and lined with roots that made every step a careful negotiation with the ground beneath me. My boots crunched over dry leaves, and the occasional twig snapped sharply, echoing louder than I would have expected in such a quiet place. It was late afternoon when I noticed something odd. There was a faint, pungent smell carried by the breeze, like raw meat mixed with the damp, earthy scent of decaying leaves. At first, I thought it was a dead animal. The forest often claimed deer or smaller mammals, and it wasn't unusual to find remains on remote trails. But as I drew closer, the smell intensified, sharp and metallic. I stepped carefully over a fallen log, keeping my eyes peeled. That's when I saw it. The remnants of what looked like a large animal, possibly a deer, but had been torn apart in a way that made no sense for a natural predator. The body was partially hidden under some brush, and the limbs were oddly positioned, as if someone had dragged them. Blood had soaked into the soil, dark against the pale roots and brown leaves. I crouched down, studying the scene, my heart beginning to beat faster. There were deep gouges in the earth nearby, footprints that didn't belong to a bear or any animal I could identify. They were wide, flat, uneven, as if someone heavy had stumbled or staggered. My gut told me that whatever had done this was still around. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the wind stilled, the usual bird calls absent, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I checked my radio. Dead zone. Typical. My trail led further into the canyon, and I had only one option: backtrack to the main path, where reception was more reliable. But as I turned, I froze. Ahead, between two trees, I saw movement, too deliberate to be an animal, too fleeting to focus on. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing mind, telling myself it was just a deer or maybe a hiker. But hikers didn't go missing, and I knew the trail records. No one had reported entering that section today. I started moving, keeping my eyes on the shadows between the trees. Every snap of a branch underfoot made me tense. The sun was dipping low now, streaking the forest with long shadows that seemed to shift with every step. My patrol vest felt heavier than usual, my flashlight hanging ready at my side. A rustling sound came from my left, near a thick cluster of ferns. I paused, breath shallow, and waited. Nothing moved for a moment, and then the rustling started again, closer, faster, irregular, like something large was moving through the underbrush. Instinct took over. I ran, not blindly, but with every ounce of energy and awareness I had, my feet scrambling over rocks and roots. The sound behind me grew louder, closer, and my mind raced with scenarios, none of them good. I finally reached the main trail, where I could see the last rays of sunlight spilling through the trees. My radio crackled, static at first, then the voice of another ranger. "You okay?" "We lost contact for a while." I grabbed the radio, breathless, my hands shaking. "Something's out here. Animal, maybe human. I don't know." By the time backup arrived, the forest had fallen fully into night. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the trail in stark white beams. We scoured the area where I had seen movement and the site of the animal remains, but there was nothing left. No tracks, no evidence, only the forest, silent and indifferent. We stayed there for hours, circling, shining lights, but whatever had been out there had disappeared. The only thing left was the memory of the smell, sharp and iron-like, and the sense of being watched, of not being alone. I never did find out what had killed that animal, or who, or what, had been moving through the forest that evening. I've heard stories from other rangers about illegal hunting, poachers who sometimes use remote areas for gruesome work, and it fit the description. Later, signs were posted, patrols increased, but the forest never gave up its secret. I learned that night that the forest, no matter how beautiful or serene, holds dangers that aren't always obvious, and that as a ranger, you can prepare, you can patrol, you can try to protect, but you can never truly control it. Years later, walking the same trail during daylight, the place seemed normal, quiet, safe. But I always remember that first shadow, the smell, the sound of heavy, uneven footsteps following me just beyond sight. It was a reminder that the forest is alive, not with ghosts, but with realities far more terrifying than any storybook horror. And for me, that night was the moment I understood what it truly meant to walk the line between safety and the unknown. The park is still there, the trails still wind through the canyon, and life goes on. But I never walk that particular section alone at dusk anymore, because some things, once seen, leave a mark you can't erase. I had been a park ranger in the northern wilderness for almost 5 years, but nothing I had seen in that time prepared me for the night I almost lost myself to the forest. It started on a routine late-night patrol near a remote section of the park, a stretch of old-growth forest where the trees were so dense that moonlight barely reached the forest floor. I was alone, my truck parked a few hundred meters away along the gravel road that cut through the forest, headlights off, the only light coming from the weak beam of my flashlight. The air was crisp and smelled like wet pine needles. It was the kind of night where every little sound seems amplified. The rustle of leaves, a branch snapping in the distance, the low call of an owl. I was walking along the trail, checking for fallen trees and signs of illegal hunting, when I noticed something strange. The forest floor had a series of deep, irregular marks, almost like tire tracks, but much too wide for any standard vehicle. The tracks were fresh. The dirt around them was still loose. I crouched down to examine them, shining my flashlight from different angles. They weren't tire marks. They were claw marks, or at least that's what I thought at first. But they were oddly straight, like something heavy had been dragged. I followed the trail slowly, careful not to make too much noise. My radio was on, but I didn't call anyone yet. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The trees were older here, taller, and the canopy so thick that the weak light from the moon barely penetrated. My flashlight cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating small parts of the trail at a time. I noticed pieces of broken branches and patches of disturbed underbrush, as if something enormous had forced its way through. The smell hit me next, a pungent mix of wet earth and something metallic. Blood. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. Rangers are trained to investigate, not run at the first sign of trouble. As I followed the trail, I saw the first body. It was a deer, or what remained of it. The legs had been torn apart, the chest cavity exposed. The blood was fresh and glistened under my flashlight. I swallowed hard, keeping my breathing steady. I had seen dead animals before, often victims of wolves or other predators, but this was different. It was organized, almost surgical, as if someone or something was taking what it wanted and leaving the rest. I scanned the surrounding trees, shining my light in every direction. There was no movement, but I had a creeping sense of being watched. The trail led me to a small clearing. My flashlight caught the glint of metal in the distance, and I realized it was part of a hunting rifle, broken and discarded. It wasn't mine. Someone had been here recently. That thought alone made my heart rate spike. Whoever, or whatever, had done this wasn't just an animal. My mind raced through possibilities, but none made sense. Poachers, maybe, but poachers don't drag deer through thick brush and leave no tracks of their own. Something was off. I pressed on, moving carefully, following the trail. Then I saw the cabin. It was small, old, and hidden deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though I could see no one outside. I approached slowly, keeping low behind the underbrush. The door was ajar. Inside, the cabin was dark, but the smell was overpowering, blood and something I couldn't identify. There were tools scattered across the table, knives and hooks, and on the floor, more remains of deer. It looked like a makeshift processing station. Whoever was operating here wasn't just hunting. They were obsessed, methodical, and completely undisturbed by the isolation. I felt my pulse in my ears, but I had to report this. I backed out slowly, retracing my steps, and made it back to my truck. The forest seemed to hum around me, the shadows between the trees stretching like fingers. I called it in, reporting the cabin, the blood, and the mutilated animals. Backup arrived a few hours later, and we returned to the site in daylight. The cabin was empty. Nothing inside suggested anyone had lived there recently, aside from the immediate signs of animal processing. There were no tracks leading away from the cabin that we could trace. It was as if whoever, or whatever, vanished into the forest itself. Days later, the park issued warnings about illegal hunting, but no arrests were made. I went back to the area a few times during my shifts, and sometimes, in the silence of the forest, I could feel it watching. I never found a person or persons responsible. I never heard the sounds of movement again on that stretch of trail, but the memory of the blood, the claw-like marks, and the cabin never left me. It was a reminder that the forest holds secrets that no patrols, no maps, and no laws can ever fully uncover. Some nights, when I'm alone on a quiet trail, I think about how close I came to being discovered, and I feel the weight of the forest pressing down around me. It's a heavy silence, filled with the knowledge that some dangers are patient, waiting for the right moment, and the forest doesn't care if you survive. In the end, I learned something crucial. Experience, caution, and training only take you so far. Nature is indifferent, and humans can hide in it in ways that make the wilderness feel alive and hungry. I never stopped patrolling, never stopped doing my job, but that night changed how I moved through the park. Every shadow, every sound, every patch of disturbed earth now carries a weight of potential threat. And somewhere out there, deep in the old growth forest, whatever was in that cabin may still be waiting. I'll never know, but I also know that being a ranger isn't about eliminating fear. It's about respecting it, surviving it, and remembering it long after the forest goes quiet again. I still remember the night like it happened yesterday, even though it's been years. I was working as a park ranger in a stretch of wilderness that few people bothered to visit. The forest there was dense, with thick underbrush and towering pines that blocked almost all moonlight. Summer nights were usually quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and alive at the same time. You could hear the rustle of small animals, the occasional crack of a branch, and the whisper of wind moving through the treetops, but the human presence was almost non-existent. That night, I was doing a routine patrol along a back road that ran near the edge of the park. My job was simple in theory. Check for illegal camping, make sure people weren't leaving trash, and watch for poachers or suspicious activity. Most nights, I'd drive slowly along the dirt road, radio in my position every half hour, and check a few secluded trails. It was monotonous, but it was also one of the few jobs where I could spend hours alone in the forest and feel at peace. The sun had set fully by the time I reached the old logging road that branched off from the main path. I knew it was a bad idea to be out there alone after dark, but it wasn't unusual for me. The forest was my responsibility, and I didn't want to leave anything unchecked. I had my flashlight, my radio, my sidearm, and my sense of caution, enough to feel prepared. The road was overgrown and narrow, the kind where a single vehicle could get stuck in the mud if you weren't careful. I parked my truck and stepped out to take a closer look at a fallen tree I had seen from the road. The air was damp and heavy, and the smell of pine and wet soil filled my senses. As I walked closer, I noticed something odd. There were tracks, deep, wide footprints in the soft mud that definitely weren't human. They were irregular, uneven, like whoever or whatever made them was walking unsteadily. My skin crawled as I realized how fresh they were. The mud was still wet, and the edges hadn't started to dry. I followed the tracks for a short distance, keeping my flashlight low so I wouldn't give away my presence in case someone was around. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, past areas I rarely patrolled. The silence was heavier here, the darkness thicker, almost suffocating. Every small sound seemed amplified. The snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the scurrying of some unseen animal. I tried to convince myself it was probably a deer or a bear, but the size of the tracks didn't match anything common in the area. My gut told me something was wrong. Still, I had a duty to follow up, so I pressed on, sticking to the tracks as best I could. After a few hundred meters, I came across a small clearing, and my stomach dropped. There in the center was a pile of trash that had been dumped illegally. Nothing unusual about that except for the blood. There was fresh blood staining the ground and some of the debris. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to make my heart race. Whoever or whatever had been here recently had been hurt, or someone had been hurt, and it was unnerving to realize it was happening right in my park. I radioed in my location, careful not to overreact, but I wanted backup nearby, just in case. I didn't wait long before I heard a noise. Footsteps moving quickly through the underbrush, too heavy to be an animal. My flashlight beam caught something moving between the trees, just out of focus. I froze, listening as the sound came closer, then stopped suddenly. My mind raced through possibilities. Could be a poacher, a lost hiker, or something worse. My instincts told me to retreat, but my job demanded I at least check. I edged closer to the source of the noise, keeping my flashlight low, my breathing steady, trying not to make a sound. The shadows moved again, and I caught a glimpse of a figure crouched behind a tree. It wasn't fully visible, but it was human-shaped, unnervingly still. Then it ran. Fast, unnatural in its speed, darting through the trees without breaking branches. I chased it for a moment, adrenaline pumping, but the darkness swallowed it before I could get close. I stopped, chest heaving, ears straining. The silence returned, heavier than before. I knew I couldn't follow it safely. I would have been walking blindly into the dense forest at night. Instead, I retraced my steps to my truck, keeping an eye on the shadows and listening for any signs of movement. I called in the incident in detail, giving descriptions of the tracks, the blood, and the figure I'd seen. By the time backup arrived, the forest was empty, quiet as though nothing had happened. In the following days, park rangers investigated the area. We found the blood belonged to a deer, probably killed and discarded illegally, and the tracks were human, but we couldn't determine whose they were. There were no signs of a struggle, no missing persons reports nearby, and no clues to the shadow I'd seen that night. It haunted me for weeks. Every patrol I did afterward, I remembered that moment in the clearing, that feeling of being watched, the rush of running footsteps, the darkness that seemed to move on its own. Eventually, life returned to a semblance of normal, but I never forgot that night. It taught me that the wilderness, while beautiful, is unpredictable and full of secrets, some you can't explain, and some you only experience once in your life, when you are alone in the dark, responsible for a stretch of forest no one else bothers to enter. That night changed how I patrolled the park forever. I started carrying extra lights, always kept my radio on, and never went off the main roads alone after dark. It was a lesson in caution, in awareness, in respecting the unseen dangers of the wilderness. I never saw that figure again, but the memory of its sudden appearance and the raw, tense silence of the forest stayed with me. Even years later, when I patrol in a bright daylight, I remember the night I realized how alone you can really be in the forest, how quickly normal turns into something tense and primal, and how sometimes the scariest things are the ones you don't fully see, only sense. I have been a park ranger for nearly 7 years, stationed at a remote section of the Sawtooth National Forest. It was the kind of place where the trees grew so dense you could barely see the sky, and the trails twisted unpredictably through thick undergrowth, fallen logs, and rocky outcrops. Most days were quiet, too quiet sometimes, and I liked it that way. The solitude gave me time to walk the trails, check on the campsites, and keep an eye on wildlife activity. But there are days when even the quiet can feel wrong. I learned that lesson one late September night, and it's a night I'll never forget. It started as a normal evening shift. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only a grayish twilight filtered through the thick canopy of firs and pines. I was doing my usual rounds on a dirt road that wound along the edge of a steep ravine, my truck kicking up clouds of dry leaves and dust. My headlight beams cut through the darkness in two sharp, narrow columns, revealing nothing but trees and the occasional glint of animal eyes. There was no wind, which was unusual, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. Even the birds had gone silent. I had a report earlier about a missing hiker, a man who hadn't returned from Short Loop Trail. He was supposed to be back by mid-afternoon, but by the time I got the call, it was already after sunset. I parked the truck at the trailhead, grabbed my flashlight, and set off on foot. The forest was thick, the underbrush clawing at my pants and boots as I pushed deeper into the darkness. My radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other rangers, but it was faint, like it was coming from far away. I left the main trail quickly, following what little sense of direction I could muster, moving slowly, methodically, because one misstep in this terrain could leave you injured or worse. After about an hour of hiking, I found something that made my stomach turn. A backpack, torn and abandoned in the middle of the trail. The zipper had been ripped clean off, contents scattered, a half-empty water bottle, a few granola bars crushed in the dirt, and a jacket caked in mud. I scanned the area with my flashlight and saw footprints leading off the trail, heading toward the ravine. They were fresh, deeply imprinted in the soft earth, as if whoever had made them had been running. I followed them cautiously, keeping my flashlight steady, my heart starting to beat faster than normal. As I approached the ravine, I noticed broken branches and scratches along the tree trunks, as though someone, or something, had forced their way through the underbrush. The forest smelled sharp, like wet soil, and something more metallic, faint but undeniable. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. This was my job. I had to find this person, even if it meant walking into danger I couldn't see. The trail of footprints led to a narrow, jagged crevice in the rock. I shone my flashlight down into it. At first, all I could see was darkness, the bottom hidden by shadows, but then my light caught movement. A figure lying still. I called out his name, but there was no response. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a miracle or a fall that had left him there. It was more sinister. His clothes were torn, dirt smeared across his face, and his ankle was twisted at an impossible angle. He had clearly tried to climb or escape and had failed. There was no sign of anyone else, no footprints leading away, just him and the silence of the forest pressing down like a heavy weight. I radioed for backup and medical help while keeping an eye on the surrounding area. Every sound felt magnified. A branch snapping in the distance, a rustle in the leaves, the thump of my own heartbeat. I had been alone with this forest for years, but that night it felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Eventually, the rescue team arrived. They rigged a rope to lower a paramedic down to him, carefully securing him to be lifted out. It took nearly 2 hours. During that time, I stayed at the edge of the ravine, flashlight in hand, scanning the dense shadows, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that someone, or something, had been following us. But there was nothing. No other footprints, no signs, no sound. Just the empty, suffocating forest. After the hiker was lifted to safety, I walked back to my truck. The forest was quiet again, almost normal, but I couldn't shake the unease. My clothes were soaked with sweat, my hands trembling, but the thing that stayed with me was the realization that something had happened to that man that the forest had hidden until the last possible moment. No fairy tales, no ghosts, just real danger, real isolation, and a landscape that could kill in 100 unnoticed ways. By the time I reached my cabin, it was nearly dawn. I sat on the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the horizon as light slowly crept over the treetops. I felt relief that the hiker would survive, that my job had prevented a tragedy from being worse. But I also felt a lingering fear I knew I'd carry with me forever. The forest was alive in ways most people couldn't understand, and it didn't forgive mistakes. That night, I learned that fear doesn't need ghosts or monsters. It only needs the quiet knowledge that at any moment, nature could remind you who really had the upper hand. From that day on, I never underestimated the forest again. I checked my gear twice, followed every trail meticulously, and never ignored the feeling of something being off. It became part of me, the constant awareness that the wilderness isn't forgiving, and that survival often comes down to vigilance, patience, and respect for the power of the world around you. It's a lesson I still carry, and every time I walk the trails after dark, I remember that night, the night the forest reminded me of its silent, deadly truth. I had been working as a park ranger for almost 6 years at a large, heavily forested national park in the northern part of the state. It was the kind of place where the trees seemed to swallow the sun before noon, where the wind carried a chill even in the middle of summer, and where silence had weight. You could feel it pressing against your ears, making every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. I had learned to respect the forest in every way, to read it like a book, and to never underestimate it. But nothing had prepared me for what I would encounter one late October evening. The day had been long. I had patrolled the North Ridge, checking the fire lines, inspecting a few campsites, and keeping an eye out for anyone breaking park rules. The sun had dipped low behind the horizon, and the forest began to darken faster than I had expected. I had my truck parked near an old logging road that wound through the trees, a dirt path lined with pine and spruce. It was a place few people ventured, especially at night, and for good reason. The road curved sharply, sloped downhill, and had several spots where a vehicle could easily get stuck. My shift was almost over, but the radio crackled with a report of a camper who hadn't checked in from a remote section near an old ranger cabin, about 4 miles deeper into the woods. I decided I would make a quick check, thinking it would be a routine call, a hiker who had lost cell service or wandered off the trail. The truck's headlights barely penetrated the darkness. The road narrowed, and I had to slow down to a crawl. On either side, the trees were dense, their branches scratching against each other as if whispering. Every once in a while, I would catch movement at the corner of my idea, I assumed, though sometimes it looked like something larger, heavier. The air smelled damp, and the wind had picked up, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves. It was quiet, too quiet, except for the engine humming and the occasional rustle of leaves. I reached the fork where the cabin was supposed to be. The signpost was old, the paint faded, almost unreadable. I parked the truck and grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows in a narrow cone. The cabin should have been just a few hundred meters away, hidden behind a cluster of firs, but when I arrived, I froze. It was gone, not abandoned or falling apart. The building simply wasn't there. The clearing where it should have stood was empty, only the forest floor and scattered rocks visible. My heart began to thump faster, but I shook it off, thinking someone must have dismantled it. Maybe a group of campers had removed the structure years ago and nobody had updated the maps. Still, it felt wrong. Too wrong. There was a silence in the air that pressed against me, heavy and unnatural. I started back toward the truck, scanning the undergrowth with my light. That's when I saw the tracks. Human footprints, barefoot, wet mud clinging to them, leading away from the clearing in a line that disappeared into the trees. The prints were fresh, no more than an hour old. Whoever had been here had come through recently. I followed them cautiously. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became, the branches closing in overhead until I had to duck and push through. I kept my hand near my belt, where my radio and flashlight were clipped, prepared to call for backup if anything happened. Then I heard it, a faint, dragging sound like someone moving something heavy across the forest floor. I froze. The sound stopped when I stopped. I moved again, and it started again, closer this time. I could hear the faint snap of branches under weight that wasn't mine. My instinct screamed to turn around, but curiosity kept me moving forward. The trail led to a small clearing I hadn't noticed on any of the maps, barely large enough for a single vehicle. In the center lay a rusted old pickup truck, covered in moss and dirt. It had clearly been abandoned for years. But the odd thing, there were fresh scratches along the hood and deep marks on the roof like someone had dragged something across it recently. I was about to leave when I noticed the body. Partially hidden under a tarp that had been soaked and caked with mud, a man lay face down. He was alive, barely. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half open, and his clothes were torn and wet. I radioed in immediately, giving my exact location and asking for an ambulance. I stayed with him, keeping him conscious, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. He whispered something incoherent, pointing toward the woods. I didn't ask. I just shined my light where he indicated. There was nothing, just trees, silence. When the medics arrived, I followed them back to my truck. The sun had long set, leaving the forest wrapped in black velvet. We carried the man out carefully, and I stayed behind for a moment, looking at the empty clearing, the tracks leading into the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been following me the entire time. My stomach was tight, my pulse loud. Weeks later, I learned the man had been hiking alone and was attacked by another human, someone with a history of evading authorities, living in the forest for months. He had been beaten and left for dead, but had somehow managed to crawl to that clearing. The authorities never found the attacker. The forest kept its secrets. Since that night, I've driven that logging road hundreds of times, but I never take the shortcut again. I stick to the main trails. Every time I see a dark clearing or hear the snap of a branch when no one is there, I remember that night. The forest is alive in ways most people don't see, and while it may not be haunted, it has its own kind of terror. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it hides things you never want to find. I had been working as a park ranger for almost 6 years at a large, heavily forested national park in the northern part of the state. It was the kind of place where the trees seemed to swallow the sun before noon, where the wind carried a chill even in the middle of summer, and where silence had weight. You could feel it pressing against your ears, making every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot. I had learned to respect the forest in every way, to read it like a book, and to never underestimate it. But nothing had prepared me for what I would encounter one late October evening. The day had been long. I had patrolled the North Ridge, checking the fire lines, inspecting a few campsites, and keeping an eye out for anyone breaking park rules. The sun had dipped low behind the horizon, and the forest began to darken faster than I had expected. I had my truck parked near an old logging road that wound through the trees, a dirt path lined with pine and spruce. It was a place few people ventured, especially at night, and for good reason. The road curved sharply, sloped downhill, and at several spots where a vehicle could easily get stuck. My shift was almost over, but the radio crackled with a report of a camper who hadn't checked in from a remote section near an old ranger cabin, about 4 miles deeper into the woods. I decided I would make a quick check, thinking it would be a routine call, a hiker who had lost cell service or wandered off the trail. The truck's headlights barely penetrated the darkness. The road narrowed, and I had to slow down to a crawl. On either side, the trees were dense, their branches scratching against each other as if whispering. Every once in a while, I would catch movement at the corner of my deer, I assumed, though sometimes it looked like something larger, heavier. The air smelled damp, and the wind had picked up, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves. It was quiet, too quiet, except for the engine humming and the occasional rustle of leaves. I reached the fork where the cabin was supposed to be. The signpost was old, the paint faded, almost unreadable. I parked the truck and grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows in a narrow cone. The cabin should have been just a few hundred meters away, hidden behind a cluster of firs, but when I arrived, I froze. It was gone, not abandoned or falling apart. The building simply wasn't there. The clearing where it should have stood was empty, only the forest floor and scattered rocks visible. My heart began to thump faster, but I shook it off, thinking someone must have dismantled it. Maybe a group of campers had removed the structure years ago and nobody had updated the maps. Still, it felt wrong. Too wrong. There was a silence in the air that pressed against me, heavy and unnatural. I started back toward the truck, scanning the undergrowth with my light. That's when I saw the tracks. Human footprints, barefoot, wet mud clinging to them, leading away from the clearing in a line that disappeared into the trees. The prints were fresh, no more than an hour old. Whoever had been here had come through recently. I followed them cautiously. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became, the branches closing in overhead until I had to duck and push through. I kept my hand near my belt, where my radio and flashlight were clipped, prepared to call for backup if anything happened. Then I heard it, a faint, dragging sound like someone moving something heavy across the forest floor. I froze. The sound stopped when I stopped. I moved again, and it started again, closer this time. I could hear the faint snap of branches under weight that wasn't mine. My instinct screamed to turn around, but curiosity kept me moving forward. The trail led to a small clearing I hadn't noticed on any of the maps, barely large enough for a single vehicle. In the center lay a rusted old pickup truck, covered in moss and dirt. It had clearly been abandoned for years. But the odd thing, there were fresh scratches along the hood and deep marks on the roof, like someone had dragged something across it recently. I was about to leave when I noticed the body. Partially hidden under a tarp that had been soaked and caked with mud, a man lay face down. He was alive, barely. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half open, and his clothes were torn and wet. I radioed in immediately, giving my exact location and asking for an ambulance. I stayed with him, keeping him conscious, tried to ignore the growing sense of dread. He whispered something incoherent, pointing toward the woods. I didn't ask. I just shined my light where he indicated. There was nothing, just trees, silence. When the medics arrived, I followed them back to my truck. The sun had long set, leaving the forest wrapped in black velvet. We carried the man out, carefully, and I stayed behind for a moment, looking at the empty clearing, the tracks leading into the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been following me the entire time. My stomach was tight, my pulse loud. Weeks later, I learned the man had been hiking alone and was attacked by another human, someone with a history of evading authorities, living in the forest for months. He had been beaten and left for dead, but had somehow managed to crawl to that clearing. The authorities never found the attacker. The forest kept its secrets. Since that night, I've driven that logging road hundreds of times, but I never take the shortcut again. I stick to the main trails. Every time I see a dark clearing or hear the snap of a branch when no one is there, I remember that night. The forest is alive in ways most people don't see, and while it may not be haunted, it has its own kind of terror. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it hides things you never want to find. I still remember the night like it happened yesterday, even though it's been years. I was working as a park ranger in a stretch of wilderness that few people bothered to visit. The forest there was dense, with thick underbrush and towering pines that blocked almost all moonlight. Summer nights were usually quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and alive at the same time. You could hear the rustle of small animals, the occasional crack of a branch, and the whisper of wind moving through the treetops, but the human presence was almost non-existent. That night, I was doing a routine patrol along a back road that ran near the edge of the park. My job was simple in theory. Check for illegal camping, make sure people weren't leaving trash, and watch for poachers or suspicious activity. Most nights, I drive slowly along the dirt road, radio in my position every half hour, and check a few secluded trails. It was monotonous, but it was also one of the few jobs where I could spend hours alone in the forest and feel at peace. The sun had set fully by the time I reached the old logging road that branched off from the main path. I knew it was a bad idea to be out there alone after dark, but it wasn't unusual for me. The forest was my responsibility, and I didn't want to leave anything unchecked. I had my flashlight, my radio, my sidearm, and my sense of caution, enough to feel prepared. The road was overgrown and narrow, the kind where a single vehicle could get stuck in the mud if you weren't careful. I parked my truck and stepped out to take a closer look at a fallen tree I had seen from the road. The air was damp and heavy, and the smell of pine and wet soil filled my senses. As I walked closer, I noticed something odd. There were tracks, deep, wide footprints in the soft mud that definitely weren't human. They were irregular, uneven, like whoever or whatever made them was walking unsteadily. My skin crawled as I realized how fresh they were. The mud was still wet, and the edges hadn't started to dry. I followed the tracks for a short distance, keeping my flashlight low so I wouldn't give away my presence in case someone was around. The tracks led me deeper into the forest, past areas I rarely patrolled. The silence was heavier here, the darkness thicker, almost suffocating. Every small sound seemed amplified. The snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the scurrying of some unseen animal. I tried to convince myself it was probably a deer or a bear, but the size of the tracks didn't match anything common in the area. My gut told me something was wrong. Still, I had a duty to follow up, so I pressed on, sticking to the tracks as best I could. After a few hundred meters, I came across a small clearing, and my stomach dropped. There in the center was a pile of trash that had been dumped illegally. Nothing unusual about that except for the blood. There was fresh blood staining the ground and some of the debris. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to make my heart race. Whoever or whatever had been here recently had been hurt, or someone had been hurt, and it was unnerving to realize it was happening right in my park. I radioed to my location, careful not to overreact, but I wanted backup nearby, just in case. I didn't wait long before I heard a noise. Footsteps moving quickly through the underbrush, too heavy to be an animal. My flashlight beam caught something moving between the trees, just out of focus. I froze, listening as the sound came closer, then stopped suddenly. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a poacher, a lost hiker, or something worse? My instincts told me to retreat, but my job demanded I at least check. I edged closer to the source of the noise, keeping my flashlight low, my breathing steady, trying not to make a sound. The shadows moved again, and I caught a glimpse of a figure crouched behind a tree. It wasn't fully visible, but it was human-shaped, unnervingly still. Then it ran, fast, unnatural in its speed, darting through the trees without breaking branches. I chased it for a moment, adrenaline pumping, but the darkness swallowed it before I could get close. I stopped, chest heaving, ears straining. The silence returned, heavier than before. I knew I couldn't follow it safely. I would have been walking blindly into the dense forest at night. Instead, I retraced my steps to my truck, keeping an eye on the shadows and listening for any signs of movement. I called in the incident in detail, giving descriptions of the tracks, the blood, and the figure I'd seen. By the time backup arrived, the forest was empty, quiet as though nothing had happened. In the following days, park rangers investigated the area. We found the blood belonged to a deer, probably killed and discarded illegally, and the tracks were human, but we couldn't determine whose they were. There were no signs of struggle, no missing persons reports nearby, and no clues to the shadow I'd seen that night. It haunted me for weeks. Every patrol I did afterward, I remembered that moment in the clearing, that feeling of being watched, the rush of running footsteps, the darkness that seemed to move on its own. Eventually, life returned to a semblance of normal, but I never forgot that night. It taught me that the wilderness, while beautiful, is unpredictable and full of secrets, some you can't explain, and some you only experience once in your life, when you are alone in the dark, responsible for a stretch of forest no one else bothers to enter. That night changed how I patrolled the park forever. I started carrying extra lights, always kept my radio on, and never went off the main roads alone after dark. It was a lesson in caution, in awareness, in respecting the unseen dangers of the wilderness. I never saw that figure again, but the memory of its sudden appearance and the raw, tense silence of the forest stayed with me. Even years later, when I patrol under bright daylight, I remember the night I realized how alone you can really be in the forest, how quickly normal turns into something tense and primal, and how sometimes the scariest things are the ones you don't fully see, only sense. I had been a park ranger for nearly 7 years, stationed at a remote section of the Sawtooth National Forest. It was the kind of place where the trees grew so dense you could barely see the sky, and the trails twisted unpredictably through thick undergrowth, fallen logs, and rocky outcrops. Most days were quiet, too quiet sometimes, and I liked it that way. The solitude gave me time to walk the trails, check on the campsites, and keep an eye on wildlife activity. But there are days when even the quiet can feel wrong. I learned that lesson one late September night, and it's a night I'll never forget. It started as a normal evening shift. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only a grayish twilight filtered through the thick canopy of firs and pines. I was doing my usual rounds on a dirt road that wound along the edge of a steep ravine, my truck kicking up clouds of dry leaves and dust. My headlight beams cut through the darkness in two sharp, narrow columns, revealing nothing but trees and the occasional glint of animal eyes. There was no wind, which was unusual, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. Even the birds had gone silent. I had a report earlier about a missing hiker, a man who hadn't returned from Short Loop Trail. He was supposed to be back by mid-afternoon, but by the time I got the call, it was already after sunset. I parked the truck at the trailhead, grabbed my flashlight, and set off on foot. The forest was thick, the underbrush clawing at my pants and boots as I pushed deeper into the darkness. My radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other rangers, but it was faint, like it was coming from far away. I left the main trail quickly, following what little sense of direction I could muster, moving slowly, methodically, because one misstep in this terrain could leave you injured or worse. After about an hour of hiking, I found something that made my stomach turn. A backpack, torn and abandoned in the middle of the trail. The zipper had been ripped clean off, contents scattered. a half-empty water bottle, a few granola bars crushed in the dirt, and a jacket caked in mud. I scanned the area with my flashlight and saw footprints leading off the trail, heading toward the ravine. They were fresh, deeply imprinted in the soft earth, as if whoever had made them had been running. I followed them cautiously, keeping my flashlight steady, my heart starting to beat faster than normal. As I approached the ravine, I noticed broken branches and scratches along the tree trunks, as though someone, or something, had forced their way through the underbrush. The forest smelled sharp, like wet soil and something more metallic, faint but undeniable. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. This was my job. I had to find this person, even if it meant walking into danger I couldn't see. The trail of footprints led to a narrow, jagged crevice in the rock. I shone my flashlight down into it. At first, all I could see was darkness, the bottom hidden by shadows, but then my light caught movement. A figure, lying still. I called out his name, but there was no response. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a miracle or a fall that had left him there. It was more sinister. His clothes were torn, dirt smeared across his face, and his ankle was twisted at an impossible angle. He had clearly tried to climb or escape and had failed. There was no sign of anyone else, no footprints leading away, just him and the silence of the forest pressing down like a heavy weight. I radioed for backup and medical help while keeping an eye on the surrounding area. Every sound felt magnified. A branch snapping in the distance, a rustle in the leaves, the thump of my own heartbeat. I had been alone with this forest for years, but that night it felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Eventually, the rescue team arrived. They rigged a rope to lower a paramedic down to him, carefully securing him to be lifted out. It took nearly 2 hours. During that time, I stayed at the edge of the ravine, flashlight in hand, scanning the dense shadows, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that someone, or something, had been following us. But there was nothing. No other footprints, no signs, no sound. Just the empty, suffocating forest. After the hiker was lifted to safety, I walked back to my truck. The forest was quiet again, almost normal, but I couldn't shake the unease. My clothes were soaked with sweat, my hands trembling. But the thing that stayed with me was the realization that something had happened to that man that the forest had hidden until the last possible moment. No fairy tales, no ghosts, just real danger, real isolation, and a landscape that could kill in 100 unnoticed ways. By the time I reached my cabin, it was nearly dawn. I sat on the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the horizon as light slowly crept over the treetops. I felt relief that the hiker would survive, that my job had prevented a tragedy from being worse. But I also felt a lingering fear I knew I'd carry with me forever. The forest was alive in ways most people couldn't understand, and it didn't forgive mistakes. That night, I learned that fear doesn't need ghosts or monsters. It only needs the quiet knowledge that at any moment, nature could remind you who really had the upper hand. From that day on, I never underestimated the forest again. I checked my gear twice, followed every trail meticulously, and never ignored the feeling of something being off. It became part of me. The constant awareness that the wilderness isn't forgiving, and that survival often comes down to vigilance, patience, and respect for the power of the world around you. It's a lesson I still carry, and every time I walk the trails after dark, I remember that night. The night the forest reminded me of its silent, deadly truth. I've been a park ranger for nearly 10 years, mostly in the northern forests, and I've seen my share of strange and unsettling things. But one night early in the fall season, I experienced something that still sits heavy in my chest when I think about it. It wasn't paranormal, it wasn't a ghost or fairy tale nonsense, just a raw, terrifying brush with human unpredictability in the wilderness. It was late October, and the forest was quiet in that early nighttime hush that comes when the air has that sharp bite, but the ground hasn't frozen yet. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving behind bare branches and a thick carpet of dried leaves that crunched underfoot. I was doing my usual patrol, driving slowly along a seldom used dirt road that twisted through the heart of the park. My truck's headlights barely penetrated the darkness beyond the shoulder of the road. Occasionally, I catch a pair of reflective eyes in the beams, usually deer or the occasional coyote. But that night, there was something different. About 15 miles in, I saw a small clearing where a dirt trail led off into the woods. I had never marked it on any map and hadn't heard of anyone using it. Something in me told me to check it out. Not because I was curious, exactly, but because park rangers develop instincts over years of being out here alone. I parked my truck at the edge of the clearing and grabbed my flashlight, moving slowly down the narrow trail. The trees leaned overhead, their branches clawing at each other with the wind. The air was damp and carried that wet, earthy smell of decaying leaves. I had gone maybe 100 feet when I noticed something on the ground. At first, it looked like a pile of debris, but the shape was wrong. It was a man, curled up on his side, thin, wearing a torn jacket, his face partially hidden in the leaves. My heart thumped, and I called out but got no answer. There was no movement at all, and for a long moment, I froze. I couldn't see any sign of injury, just the way he was positioned, stiff and quiet, that made my stomach twist. I crouched down and touched his shoulder lightly. He flinched violently. That alone was enough to remind me he was alive. I shone my flashlight on his face. He was pale, his lips chapped, and his eyes wide with fear. He muttered something incoherent, shaking. I kept my voice low, calm, the only tool I had to anchor him. This wasn't a situation where panic helped anyone. I could smell the alcohol on his breath immediately. It was strong, almost sickly sweet, and the kind that suggested he'd been drinking heavily for hours. His hands were trembling, probably both from the cold and the alcohol. I realized he must have wandered away from somewhere, gotten lost, and passed out here in the woods. That part explained everything. His fear, his confusion, the desperation in his eyes. But it also meant he could be dangerous. People can do unpredictable things when they're alone, cold, and panicked. I tried to assess him quickly. No serious wounds, but he was soaked, shivering, and clearly disoriented. I decided the safest thing was to get him out of there. I guided him slowly back to my truck, keeping him talking with short, simple instructions. His legs were unsteady, and every time he stumbled, I braced him. The forest seemed louder now, the wind rattling the branches, the distant call of a fox, the crack of twigs under my boots. It all felt amplified, almost aggressive, as if the woods themselves were aware of the human panic and amplifying it. Once we reached the truck, I got him inside, started the engine, and cranked the heat. He sat hunched over, silent, shaking, looking anywhere but at me. I had my radio out, calling dispatch, giving them coordinates and explaining the situation. I would need backup, maybe medical attention, and someone to handle the paperwork if this ended up being a criminal case. We drove in silence for a few minutes. He didn't speak, just stared out the window at the dark shapes of trees slipping past. Finally, he murmured something about not wanting to go back. It wasn't an explanation, not really, but it gave me a clue. This wasn't just a lost hiker. He had run, maybe from a fight, maybe from someone chasing him, maybe from himself. Whatever it was, the forest had swallowed him up until I found him. By the time we reached the ranger station, the sun was almost completely gone and the temperature had dropped sharply. Backup was waiting, and we managed to get him inside the building, warmed up, and fed. It turned out later that he had been involved in some petty crimes and had decided to hide in the woods for a few days, drinking whatever he could find to keep warm and pass the time. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified, but he was alive, which was the only thing that mattered. Even now, thinking back, I can't shake the feeling of isolation that night. The woods weren't haunted, they weren't supernatural. They were just vast, quiet, and capable of swallowing people whole if they weren't careful. The danger was real because humans are unpredictable, because we can make mistakes and get lost, because fear can take over when there's no one else around. I never forgot that night. Every time I patrol that forest, I think about the man curled in the leaves and the absolute silence that pressed down around me as I guided him back to safety. It reminded me why I do this job, why I carry extra supplies, why I always trust my instincts, and why the forest, no matter how familiar, is never something to underestimate. It isn't magic, it isn't haunted, it's just real, and that reality is enough to be terrifying. I have been a park ranger in the northern forests of Idaho for nearly 7 years, and I thought I had seen it all. I knew the woods better than most, every trail, creek, and ridge, every bend in the river, every thick grove of pines and firs. I knew the sounds of the forest at night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote, but nothing could prepare me for the night I spent alone near a backcountry trail in the Selkirk Mountains. It started as a routine patrol. I had a backpack with basic supplies, my flashlight, my radio, and a small first aid kit. The weather was colder than usual for late September, with a crispness in the air that made every breath visible. The trees were shedding their leaves in a golden shower that glittered under the dim evening light. I was checking a seldom-used trail that ran parallel to the North Fork River, a narrow path that wound through thick timber, over small ridges, and past rocky outcroppings. I reached the part of the trail where it curved along a small cliffside, a place where the river below glimmered silver in the fading light. I stopped to check the trail markers, and that's when I noticed the first odd thing. Footprints. They were human, or at least resembled human boots, but they were large, at least a size 12, and the stride was uneven, almost dragging in places. What caught my attention was how fresh they were. Mud still clinging to the soles, no older than a few hours. That struck me immediately because this trail was almost never used, and I had been the last person through 2 days ago. I followed the tracks for a few hundred feet. My instincts told me to be careful, but curiosity kept me moving. The footprints led toward a denser section of the forest where the moonlight barely reached the ground. The trees were older here, and the undergrowth was thick, making it hard to walk quietly. I could hear my own boots crunching on the dry leaves and small sticks, but I told myself that was normal. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made me freeze. Ahead, between two large pines, there was a small clearing. In the middle, a backpack had been left on the ground, its straps tangled in a bush. I approached slowly, keeping low and scanning the shadows. There were no people in sight. No sounds except the distant river and the occasional creak of branches. I checked the backpack carefully. It was empty, no food, no water, no identification. Nothing to indicate who had left it. The moment I looked up from the backpack, I felt it. A presence, something just beyond the tree line, moving with quiet purpose. I could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling, something or someone was following me. I froze, heart hammering, eyes scanning the darkness. The forest was suddenly alive in a way that felt hostile. My training told me to stay calm, stay visible, but I felt like I was being watched by someone who did not want to be found. I slowly backed toward the trail, trying to stay on the path while keeping my flashlight ready. That's when I saw it. A figure emerging from the trees, hunched over, moving in a strange, awkward gait. I couldn't make out details in the shadows, but the shape was humanoid, tall, and unsettling. I tried my radio, calling for backup, but the static was the only reply. The figure stopped as soon as I tried to shine the flashlight, then vanished into the darkness. My pulse was racing, but I knew I had to get out of there. I retraced my steps toward the main trail, moving faster now. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I kept telling myself it was just a hunter, a hiker, maybe even a lost camper. But the way it moved, the way it seemed to anticipate me, made my stomach churn with fear. Eventually, I reached the lower trail that led back toward the ranger station. My radio crackled to life with the voice of a colleague, and I nearly shouted in relief. I reported my findings, the footprints, the abandoned backpack, and the figure. They told me to stay put until backup arrived. 15 minutes later, 2 other rangers came up the trail. We searched the area, but there was no sign of anyone, no footprints other than the ones I'd seen, no backpack, nothing. It It was as if whatever had been there had vanished into the night without leaving a trace. The thing that stayed with me, even after the search, was the feeling of being watched. In the following weeks, I checked the trail every day. Nothing unusual ever appeared again. Yet sometimes at night, when I closed my eyes, I could see that dark figure lurking just beyond the tree line, and I could feel the way it moved, deliberate and patient. I never discovered who or what it was, but I learned a lesson that night. The forest is alive in ways you don't always see, and sometimes being alone, even in a place you know, is enough to remind you that the woods belong to someone or something else. By the end of my shift, I had convinced myself of one thing. The forest will protect its own secrets. And maybe, just maybe, it had allowed me to leave that night because it was curious, not because it was kind. I never went back to that trail after dark again. I remember the day clearly, though it was years ago. I had been a park ranger at Pine Creek National Forest for about 3 years at that point. The park was huge, stretching over hundreds of square miles of dense woods, rocky outcrops, and winding trails. I usually loved the solitude, the quiet, and the smell of pine and wet earth. But on that particular day, something about the forest felt off. I was assigned a routine patrol along one of the lesser-used trails, a narrow path that twisted along the river and into a section of the forest where the trees grew so close together it seemed like daylight struggled to reach the ground. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already low in the sky. Shadows were stretching long and dark across the trail. I had my usual gear, a flashlight, a first aid kit, my radio, and a notepad. I wore a sturdy jacket and my boots were lace tight. I walked slowly, scanning the trail for anything unusual. Fallen trees, broken branches, litter. Nothing seemed out of place at first. Birds called here and there, squirrels scampered in the underbrush, and the river ran smoothly beside the trail. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp moss and decaying leaves. After about an hour of walking, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A set of footprints in the mud beside the trail. They weren't my own, and they didn't match the tracks of any animal I knew. They were human, large, and oddly spaced. What made them stranger was that they led into a thicket off the trail, disappearing under the trees. My first thought was that someone had gone off trail, maybe lost or trespassing. I noted the direction of the tracks in my logbook, thinking I might have to check back later. I continued down the path, but a gnawing feeling of unease settled in my chest. It was subtle at first, a slight tightening of my stomach, the sense that something was watching, but it grew stronger the deeper I went. The forest around me became quieter, almost unnaturally so. Birds had stopped singing, and the usual rustle of small animals in the brush was gone. Even the river seemed quieter, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I spotted something that made my heart skip. A bicycle lying on its side near the edge of the river. The paint was scratched, the handlebars twisted, and there were scuff marks in the mud leading away from it. No one was in sight. I crouched down and looked closer. There were no personal belongings, no backpack, no water bottle, just the abandoned bike. The scene gave me a sinking feeling. Something wasn't right. I radioed the ranger station, describing the situation. The response was calm but tense. They reminded me to stay put and not wander too far off the trail. I waited for instructions, watching the forest around me. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me flinch. Then I noticed movement. Just beyond the riverbank, something was crouched low, moving quickly between the trees. I couldn't see clearly, but it was human-sized, and it moved in jerky, unnatural motions. I decided I needed to get back to the main trail. Slowly, carefully, I turned and retraced my steps. Every sense was heightened. My hands gripped my flashlight like a weapon. I forced myself to walk calmly, but the shadow of that movement stayed with me, shifting between the trees, always just out of clear sight. By the time I reached the main trail, the light of the setting sun had almost disappeared, leaving the forest in a deep, uneven darkness. I radioed in again and started walking toward the ranger station, my pace quickening. I passed the footprints again, now eerily easy to see in the mud, and something about them made me stop. The tracks were larger than before, fresher, and they seemed to follow me, paralleling my own steps. My stomach dropped. Whoever, or whatever, had been here wasn't gone. By the time I reached the ranger station, night had fully settled in. The building felt small and fragile in the darkness, surrounded by the looming trees. I reported everything in detail. The dispatch team promised to send another ranger to check the area at first light, and I stayed in the station for the rest of the night, too tense to sleep. The next morning, a search team went to the section of trail where I had found the footprints and the bike. They found no signs of anyone else, no footprints, no discarded items, nothing. It was as if the person, or people, had vanished into the forest. The bike remained, still lying where I'd seen it, but the tracks were gone. I logged the incident, marking it as unexplained, and kept patrols tighter in that area after that day. Years later, I still think about that night. I never found out who was there or what they were doing. There were no ghost stories, no creatures, just a very real, human presence that I couldn't explain. It taught me to respect the forest silence, its shadows, and its secrets. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones that make perfect sense, things that are real enough to touch, yet vanish before you can catch them. And I've learned that in the woods, being alert isn't just about safety, it's about survival. That day changed how I patrolled. I started walking with a partner whenever possible, keeping my flashlight in hand even in daylight, and always marking unusual signs immediately. The forest can be beautiful, peaceful, even comforting, but can also hide dangers you might never see coming, dangers that leave no trace once they're gone. I never saw anyone that night again, but every time I walk that trail, I can't shake the memory of those tracks in the mud, or the way something seemed to be watching me, just beyond sight, waiting.